Trapped in a city of fire and ice, an entire army faced a storm they could never escape. Stalingrad was about to consume them. The once proud Sixth Army of Nazi Germany, encircled and overextended, clung to the streets of a city reduced to rubble, unaware that a storm was gathering beyond their lines. A storm known as Operation Uranus. Conceived in the shadowed halls of Soviet command, meticulously planned by Generals Zhukov and Vasilevsky, it was a bold counteroffensive designed to encircle the invaders, cutting them off from reinforcements, supplies, and any hope of escape. Across the Don and Cher rivers, Soviet troops moved with quiet precision, camouflaged in snow and obscured by the biting winter fog, ready to strike the flanks of the German forces, where defenses were weakest and arrogance most fatal. The streets of Stalingrad themselves were a maze of destruction, burned-out factories, shattered apartment blocks, and scorched earth that had witnessed months of brutal urban warfare, where every corner and cellar became a battlefield. Civilians, soldiers, and foreign volunteers alike had endured unimaginable suffering, the city a crucible of human endurance, fear, and sacrifice, as both attackers and defenders paid in blood for every meter of ground. As Operation Uranus unfolded, the Soviet pincer would slowly close, cutting off the German Sixth Army and transforming their tactical advantage into a strategic trap from which retreat would be impossible. Letters, diaries, and radio broadcasts captured the despair of soldiers trapped behind frozen wire and the relentless optimism of Soviet commanders determined to rewrite the course of the Eastern Front. This is the entire story of Operation Uranus, its planning, its execution, the heroism and horror of those involved, and the turning point that would seal the fate of Stalingrad and echo through the annals of history. So settle in, close your eyes, and prepare to witness, in haunting detail, the monumental struggle, the human cost, and the unyielding will that defined one of the most decisive battles of World War II. And before we begin, share in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is there, because across continents and generations, the story of Stalingrad unites us in memory and reflection. The summer of 1942 dawned with the German Wehrmacht still seemingly unstoppable across vast stretches of the Soviet Union, having driven deep into the heart of the East during the previous year's Operation Barbarossa. Despite the bitter winter counteroffensive around Moscow in late 1941, which had bloodied but not broken German forces, Hitler remained convinced that a renewed push could still secure victory. He envisioned a decisive campaign to cripple the Soviet Union's capacity to wage war by striking at its economic lifelines rather than at its political capital. This ambition crystallized into Case Blue, a massive strategic offensive designed to seize the oil-rich Caucasus, the breadbasket of Ukraine, and the vital arteries of the Volga River. The German High Command prepared for this new assault with a sense of urgency, aware that oil was the lifeblood of modern mechanized warfare, and their reserves were dwindling. Hitler, obsessed with resources, believed that capturing the Caucasus would both fuel his army and deprive the Soviets of their energy supplies. Yet the decision meant stretching German forces over enormous distances, creating dangerous vulnerabilities along their extended flanks. While planners dreamed of oil fields at Baku and Grozny, many commanders worried that the vastness of the Soviet landscape would swallow their divisions. Nevertheless, the orders were clear. The summer of 1942 would be the campaign to secure the South. It was this vision that set the stage for the road to Stalingrad. Case Blue was launched in late June 1942, beginning with rapid German advances that cut deep into Soviet territory, leaving Red Army units reeling in confusion and retreat. The Wehrmacht's armored spearheads surged eastward with terrifying speed, creating the impression of another unstoppable blitzkrieg that would overwhelm the Soviets. Soviet resistance initially collapsed under the weight of German mechanized forces, who seemed to slice through defenses as though they were paper. Yet behind the chaos, Stalin and his generals were already calculating how to exploit the vulnerabilities of the German plan. The Soviets had learned bitter lessons from 1941. They could not fight the Germans head-to-head in open maneuver warfare, but they could draw them deeper, stretch their supply lines, and then strike where the enemy was weakest. While Hitler envisioned an inexorable march toward the oil fields, Soviet intelligence carefully tracked German movements and anticipated the strain it placed on their forces. In the south, German divisions were already split into two major army groups, one driving toward the Caucasus, the other shadowing the Volga. The further they advanced, the thinner their lines became, particularly where their Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian allies were asked to hold the flanks. The rapid thrust eastward seemed impressive, but the seeds of disaster were being sown in the very foundations of German success. Hitler's fixation on oil shaped every operational decision, compelling him to issue orders that often baffled his generals. He was determined not only to seize the Caucasus fields, but also to secure Stalingrad, the city that bore Stalin's name, a symbolic jewel he could not resist. The split between the southern drives, Army Group A toward the Caucasus and Army Group B toward the Volga, created a dangerous dispersion of strength. For the first time in the war, German officers openly questioned whether the Führer's strategic vision had exceeded the operational capacity of his armies. Luftwaffe units struggled to keep up with the advancing front, and supply trains groaned under the weight of moving fuel and ammunition across hundreds of miles of primitive Soviet rail. Meanwhile, Stalin had ordered a ruthless policy of scorched earth, ensuring that retreating Soviet forces destroyed infrastructure and supplies to deny them to the enemy. German troops marched through smoldering villages and barren landscapes, capturing territory that offered little to sustain them. Still, the Wehrmacht pressed forward, driven by the promise of decisive victory and by Hitler's unrelenting demands. The obsession with both oil and symbolism meant that the campaign became a duel of wills between two dictators. And in that duel, Stalingrad began to loom larger with every passing week. For the German soldiers on the ground, the campaign was a paradox of triumph and exhaustion, of victories on the map but strain in the ranks. Many remembered the brutal winter before Moscow, where frostbite and hunger had cut as deep as Soviet bullets. Now in the burning summer of 1942, they marched across open steppes under a merciless sun, dust choking their throats, and water often more precious than ammunition. German divisions smashed through Soviet defenses, yet the enemy never seemed to vanish entirely, always retreating, regrouping, and returning with new units. The further east they advanced, the longer their supply lines grew, and the more they relied on unreliable allies to guard their vulnerable flanks. Soldiers joked bitterly about marching to the ends of the earth, yet their commanders were keenly aware that each mile further into Russia multiplied their risks. Vehicles broke down, fuel convoys lagged, and the sense of invincibility that had marked 1941 gave way to unease. Soviet partisans harassed rear areas, blowing up bridges and ambushing supply trains. The land itself seemed hostile, swallowing armies in endless plains where distance was the greatest enemy. Still the Wehrmacht pressed on, driven by the dream of oil conquest and Hitler's voice echoing commands from Berlin. On the Soviet side, the summer of 1942 was one of desperation, but also determination. Stalin had no illusions about the magnitude of the threat. If the Caucasus oil was lost, the Red Army's ability to continue fighting would collapse. Factories were relocated further east, churning out tanks and guns at a pace unmatched by German industry, while new divisions of Siberian troops and conscripts from across the vast Soviet Union filled the ranks. Soviet commanders such as Zhukov and Vasilevsky studied the German strategy with precision, recognizing both its dangers and its flaws. They saw the long, exposed German flanks, held by weaker Allied armies, as potential weak points to exploit. Stalin, infamous for his iron will, issued orders forbidding retreat, demanding that every inch of ground be defended with ferocity. Civilians were pressed into constructing fortifications, and the Soviet propaganda machine rallied the nation around the idea of total resistance. Soviet intelligence reported on German troop concentrations, carefully tracking movements toward Stalingrad. Though battered, the Red Army was not broken. It was adapting, learning, and preparing. The summer of 1942 was the crucible in which Soviet resilience hardened into the steel that would soon strike back. Hitler's generals increasingly grew concerned about the pace and scope of operations, but their objections fell on deaf ears. Hitler micromanaged strategy from afar, dismissing his field commander's warnings and insisting that both the Caucasus and Stalingrad must fall simultaneously. The split focus meant that neither objective was pursued with overwhelming force, creating a dangerous overextension. German tanks roared toward the oil fields, but their supply lines stretched like taut strings ready to snap. Meanwhile, at Stalingrad, units began to mass along the Volga, preparing for an urban struggle unlike anything the Wehrmacht had yet faced. The logistical situation worsened with each passing week, as Soviet resistance stiffened and infrastructure collapsed under scorched earth tactics. Fuel shortages forced German columns to halt, their momentum stalling even as Hitler demanded renewed advances. In Berlin, propaganda painted Case Blue as a march to inevitable victory, but in the field, reality was harsher. The Wehrmacht was bleeding men and material faster than they could be replaced. The cracks in Germany's grand strategy were spreading, even if they were not yet visible to the world. As Case Blue unfolded, the Germans achieved significant territorial gains, but these victories carried with them hidden costs. The capture of Rostov-on-Don opened the gateway to the Caucasus, while advances along the Volga brought German formations ever closer to Stalingrad. Hitler basked in the glory of maps, colored with new conquests, convinced that the Soviet Union was staggering toward collapse. Yet each new mile taken was paid for with blood, fuel, and exhaustion, weakening the core strength of the Wehrmacht. Soviet counterattacks, though often beaten back, forced the Germans to commit reserves they could ill afford. Stalin ordered his commanders to trade space for time, ensuring that German progress slowed, and that every delay allowed more Soviet reinforcements to arrive. Behind the lines, entire factories had been dismantled and rebuilt in the Urals, providing the Red Army with a stream of T-34 tanks and artillery. German soldiers, once confident of quick victory, began to sense the enormity of the war they were fighting. Instead of collapsing, the Soviet Union seemed only to grow stronger the deeper the Germans pushed. This grim realization would come to dominate the final months of 1942. By September, the German drive to the Caucasus was losing momentum, while Stalingrad emerged as the focal point of Hitler's obsession. Army Group A bogged down in the mountains, unable to reach the prized oil fields, while Army Group B turned its full attention toward the Volga city. The shift in emphasis reflected not only strategic necessity, but also Hitler's hunger for a symbolic triumph, the capture of the city that bore Stalin's name. He was determined to humiliate his enemy by seizing Stalingrad and cutting the Volga lifeline no matter the cost. German units funneled into the region, and the campaign evolved into a brutal struggle for one city that would soon consume both armies. Soviet commanders understood the stakes, and Stalin himself declared that the city must be held at all costs, forbidding retreat. Civilians were trapped in the maelstrom, pressed into labor, or caught in the relentless bombardments. What had begun as a grand campaign for oil was narrowing into a showdown over a single city. The Eastern Front, already vast and bloody, was now pivoting toward the battle that would define the war, and in that pivot lay the seeds of Operation Uranus, the Soviet plan to turn the tide. In the late summer of 1942, the city of Stalingrad began to occupy a place in Hitler's imagination far larger than its size on any map might suggest. What started as part of a larger campaign to secure oil in the Caucasus suddenly narrowed into an obsession with one city on the banks of the Volga. Hitler believed that seizing Stalingrad would not only cut Soviet supply lines, but also deliver a psychological blow of unprecedented scale. The very name of the city, bearing Stalin's own, became a target that Hitler could not resist. To him, capturing it would symbolize the triumph of National Socialism over Bolshevism in the most direct way possible. In Berlin, his generals attempted to temper his fixation, arguing that other objectives were strategically more vital. Yet Hitler dismissed their concerns and doubled down on the need to take Stalingrad at all costs. He envisioned banners of the Reich fluttering over the ruins of the city, broadcast to the world as proof of Germany's inevitable victory. Thus, what began as a waypoint along the Volga turned into the centerpiece of a war of annihilation. For Joseph Stalin, the idea of surrendering the city that bore his name was inconceivable. In Moscow, he declared that the defense of Stalingrad was not only a military necessity, but also a matter of Soviet honor. His infamous "not a step back" order, issued as Order No. 227, would resonate across the Red Army, forbidding retreat under penalty of death. The city's defense became a personal matter for Stalin, who saw in it both political symbolism and strategic indispensability. To lose the city would not only embolden the Germans, but also undermine his authority at home. Every available soldier, factory worker, and civilian was called upon to resist the invader. Stalin's resolve hardened into a directive: the Volga must remain in Soviet hands, and Stalingrad must become the fortress where the German advance would falter. This confrontation, shaped by two towering egos, escalated far beyond the dictates of pure strategy. It was now a test of will, pride, and political survival. Geographically, Stalingrad sat like a dagger pointed into the heart of the Soviet Union, hugging the western bank of the Volga River. Its strategic importance extended beyond its industrial production, though its factories churned out tanks, guns, and aircraft even as bombs fell. The city served as a critical junction for transportation, linking the south to the central regions of Russia through the Volga's lifeline. If the Germans captured Stalingrad, they would sever the flow of supplies, oil, and reinforcements moving north and east. Moreover, they would effectively shield their southern thrust into the Caucasus, ensuring their flanks were secure. For the Soviets, holding the city meant safeguarding this artery and preventing the enemy from consolidating control. Thus, Stalingrad's location transformed it into one of the most pivotal battlefields of the war. Neither side could afford to relinquish it without dire consequences. The psychological dimension of the city loomed just as large as its geography. To Hitler, the propaganda value of Stalingrad was priceless, an opportunity to trumpet victory over his sworn ideological enemy. For Stalin, defending the city became an act of personal defiance, a way to prove his leadership to his people and to the world. The name itself intensified the confrontation, binding the city's fate to the reputations of both dictators. The battle was no longer just about supply lines or industrial capacity. It had become a duel of egos played out on a massive battlefield. The German High Command realized that their Führer's obsession was shaping operational priorities in dangerous ways. Similarly, Soviet commanders understood that failure was not an option, for the consequences extended beyond military defeat into the realm of political collapse. Thus, the fight for Stalingrad took on a ferocity unmatched elsewhere on the Eastern Front. By late August 1942, German forces of the Sixth Army under General Friedrich Paulus approached the outskirts of Stalingrad. Luftwaffe bombers prepared the way with a ferocious aerial assault, reducing entire districts to rubble. Ironically, the destruction only made the city more defensible for the Soviets, turning every ruined block into a fortress. The Germans expected a quick capture, imagining demoralized defenders would crumble under overwhelming firepower. Instead, they encountered a population determined to fight for every street, every building, and even every room. Stalin's order that retreat was forbidden meant Soviet soldiers stood their ground with desperate resolve. Civilians, too, joined the struggle, arming themselves with whatever weapons they could find. What had been conceived as a swift conquest transformed almost immediately into a grinding urban war. As German divisions poured into the city, the battle shifted into a brutal, close-quarters struggle unlike anything the Wehrmacht had previously faced. Stalingrad's factories and apartment blocks became arenas of hand-to-hand combat, where machine guns fired from basements and snipers stalked from shattered windows. The Soviets turned every pile of rubble into a defensive position, ambushing German units at point-blank range. The Germans, trained for sweeping maneuvers across open fields, found themselves bogged down in a city that devoured men and material. Hitler, far from reconsidering, demanded reinforcements to finish the job, convinced that victory was within reach. Yet, with every passing day, Stalingrad became less a prize to be seized, and more a quagmire that drained German strength. The obsession with taking the city blinded him to the growing danger of Soviet counteroffensives forming beyond the horizon. Inside the Soviet command, generals like Zhukov and Vasilevsky began to see opportunity in Hitler's fixation. If the Germans were determined to pour their strength into the ruins of Stalingrad, then perhaps the Red Army could exploit this concentration. Plans began to form for a massive counterstroke, one that would encircle the attackers and turn Hitler's prize into a death trap. The more German divisions bled themselves dry inside the city, the greater the opportunity for Soviet forces massing on the flanks. Stalingrad was becoming both bait and battlefield, a lure that drew in the Wehrmacht under the guise of inevitable victory. Stalin, informed of these developments, approved the idea with grim satisfaction. The city that bore his name would not simply resist, it would become the anvil upon which Germany's strength would shatter. By autumn 1942, Stalingrad was no longer just a city under siege, it was the epicenter of the entire war in the East. From Berlin to Moscow, from Washington to London, the eyes of the world turned to the clash along the Volga. Propaganda from both sides elevated the struggle to mythic proportions, portraying it as a decisive showdown between fascism and communism. Soldiers fighting in the rubble knew they were part of something larger than themselves, their survival intertwined with the fate of nations. Each burned-out building, each ruined factory became a symbol of resistance or conquest. Hitler's obsession and Stalin's defiance had locked the city into a battle that would decide the trajectory of the entire conflict. Stalingrad was no longer just an objective, it had become the crucible in which the future of the war would be forged. When German forces finally entered Stalingrad in September 1942, they expected a swift conquest, but instead they stepped into a nightmare of grinding urban warfare. The Luftwaffe had already reduced vast portions of the city to rubble, but the destruction served only to transform streets into defensive labyrinths. Soviet soldiers and civilians alike dug into the ruins, turning basements into bunkers and shattered factories into fortresses. Every meter of ground had to be won through costly assaults, and German officers soon discovered that taking a single building might require days of fighting. The Soviets organized their defenses into zones, each commanded by stubborn officers determined to bleed the enemy dry. In this shattered environment, traditional military tactics lost much of their meaning. Tanks found themselves trapped between collapsed walls, artillery fire merely shifted piles of rubble, and infantry fought for rooms, staircases, and corridors. The German army, once master of maneuver warfare, now found itself bogged down in a brawl that consumed men at an astonishing rate. The city became less a battlefield and more a grinder, swallowing soldiers on both sides. The Soviets called their approach hugging the enemy, a tactic designed to neutralize German advantages in firepower and air support. Soviet units entrenched themselves so close to the attackers that German artillery and aircraft could not be used without risking friendly casualties. The defenders often operated in small groups, swarming German units and retreating only to regroup for another assault. Snipers became legendary in this environment, with figures like Vasily Zaitsev picking off enemy officers and machine gunners one by one, spreading fear among the advancing troops. Entire sectors of the city turned into hunting grounds where a single marksman could delay hundreds of soldiers. For the Germans, the war of movement had become a war of attrition, one in which their superiority in tanks and aircraft mattered less than sheer grit. As winter began to creep closer, the situation only grew more desperate, and the soldiers on both sides felt the weight of every block gained or lost. Each sunrise promised another day of close-quarter slaughter. The industrial heart of the city became the center of the bloodletting. Factories such as the Red October, Barricade, and Dzerjinsky tractor plant were transformed into arenas of unimaginable combat. Production lines were abandoned only to be converted into barricades, while broken-down machines became cover for machine gun nests. Soviet workers had often continued producing weapons even as fighting raged outside, and now their factories turned into fortresses of defiance. German infantry advanced cautiously through these metal jungles, where every corner might conceal a defender with a rifle or grenade. Battles in these factories were measured not in kilometers but in meters, as soldiers fought across assembly floors and stairwells. The roar of engines, the clang of steel, and the echo of gunfire merged into a single cacophony. Both sides poured reinforcements into these zones, knowing that control of the factories meant control of the industrial spine of Stalingrad. It was here that the city earned its reputation as the most brutal battlefield of the war. Civilians who had not fled before the German advance found themselves trapped in the hell of Stalingrad. Entire families hid in cellars, emerging only at night to scavenge for food or water. Many joined the fight directly, carrying ammunition, tending the wounded, or even wielding weapons themselves. The line between soldier and civilian blurred completely, and for the Germans, this created a nightmare of constant resistance. Every encounter with a seemingly harmless old man or young boy might end with a grenade being hurled at them. Stalin had ordered that the city must be held at all costs, and his directive turned even ordinary citizens into combatants. For the Germans, this was not just a military struggle but a psychological one, as the city itself seemed determined to resist them. Civilians paid a terrible price, starving, freezing, and dying in bombings, yet their presence stiffened Soviet resolve. The defenders drew strength from the knowledge that they were not only protecting a city, but also their families, their homes, and their very way of life. German commanders attempted to impose order on the chaos by deploying specialized assault groups designed to capture buildings. These groups combined infantry, engineers, flamethrowers, and artillery support in compact formations intended to storm fortified positions. Yet even with these adjustments, progress was excruciatingly slow. A building taken in the morning might be lost by nightfall, as Soviet counterattacks surged back with ferocity. The very rubble that impeded German tanks provided endless opportunities for Soviet defenders to strike back. Machine guns hidden in collapsed walls could unleash devastating crossfire, while mines and booby traps turned every approach into a deadly gamble. Urban warfare sapped German morale, as victories were fleeting and casualties mounted relentlessly. What had once been an army of swift conquests now fought like a boxer trapped in the corner, swinging wildly and burning energy with little to show for it. The brutality of the fighting shocked even hardened veterans. Soldiers spoke of Rattenkrieg, the Rat War, to describe the endless cycle of assaults and counter-assaults inside Stalingrad. In the sewers, combatants fought in the dark, crawling through filth to ambush their enemies. In the upper stories of ruined buildings, machine gun teams dueled across shattered windows only meters apart. The front lines shifted constantly, sometimes with German troops on one floor of a building, while Soviets occupied the floor above or below. Hand grenades, knives, and bayonets became as common as rifles, for combat often unfolded at arm's length. Every corner hid death, and no soldier could feel safe, not even for a moment. The constant stress ground down men's nerves until exhaustion and despair became as deadly as bullets. Stalingrad was not simply a battlefield, it was a crucible of human endurance pushed to its breaking point. The German Sixth Army, under Paulus, pressed forward despite staggering losses, driven by Hitler's obsession with capturing the city. Supplies dwindled, exhaustion spread, and units became shadows of their former strength, yet the order remained clear: Stalingrad must fall. Hitler demanded daily updates on progress, fixating on maps where colored pins advanced block by block. For the soldiers on the ground, however, maps bore little resemblance to the reality of endless ruins and ambushes. Paulus, meticulous and cautious by nature, found himself trapped by the Führer's iron will, compelled to throw his divisions into the grinder again and again. As autumn deepened, German progress slowed to a crawl, and the Sixth Army began to resemble a force bleeding itself to death. Yet Hitler's refusal to relent meant the nightmare had to continue, no matter the cost. For the Soviets, the battle was agony, but also opportunity. Every day that the Germans remained bogged down inside Stalingrad gave Soviet high command more time to prepare their counteroffensive. Generals Zhukov and Vasilevsky watched the struggle closely, calculating where the Germans were most vulnerable. Soviet defenders inside the city understood that their suffering was not in vain, for their resistance pinned down the very heart of the German advance. The Volga ferries continued to bring reinforcements across, under cover of night, supplying the embattled defenders with fresh men and weapons. Slowly, a trap was forming around the German forces, though they remained blind to it in their obsession with conquering the city. Stalingrad's defenders had become both shield and lure, sacrificing themselves to hold the enemy in place. The city itself had transformed into a battlefield of apocalyptic proportions, and soon it would become the stage for one of history's most decisive reversals. As the battle for Stalingrad raged with relentless ferocity, a parallel drama was unfolding far from the smoke and ruins, deep in the chambers of Soviet High Command. Known as Stavka, the Supreme Military Command, it brought together the most brilliant and ruthless minds of the Red Army under the iron gaze of Joseph Stalin. By autumn of 1942, the Soviet Union had endured nearly 18 months of devastating losses, but now the tide of war was beginning to shift, largely through the sheer determination of its leaders. Georgy Zhukov, the hard-nosed marshal who had already masterminded defensive victories at Moscow, emerged as the key architect of future plans. Alongside him, Alexander Vasilevsky, chief of the General Staff, provided strategic clarity and organizational brilliance. Together they studied the German Sixth Army's position inside Stalingrad and realized that the obsession of Hitler and Paulus had created an opportunity. The Germans had committed their best divisions into a city that consumed them like a firestorm. Meanwhile, their flanks, held by Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian allies, were dangerously overstretched and under-equipped. This imbalance formed the foundation of a bold idea to strike not at the heart of the German army, but at its vulnerable sides. The planning sessions in Stavka were tense, filled with maps, calculations, and heated debates. Stalin, still distrustful of his generals despite their proven skill, demanded constant justification for every suggestion. His paranoia was never far beneath the surface, yet he had begun to grudgingly respect Surkov's instincts after earlier successes. Surkov argued forcefully that a counteroffensive must be launched before winter, while the Germans were locked in Stalingrad's ruins and unable to maneuver freely. Vasilevsky reinforced this view with meticulous logistical assessments, showing how Soviet reserves had been built up across the steppe, ready to strike. Weeks of preparation had quietly shifted divisions from distant sectors, massing them behind thinly veiled screens of deception. Every train arrival had to be concealed from German aerial reconnaissance, and every movement disguised as a defensive redeployment. The result was the assembly of one of the largest surprise concentrations of men and equipment in the history of warfare. Stavka's chambers became the birthplace of a daring gamble, one that would determine whether the Soviet Union could finally seize the initiative. Intelligence gathering played a crucial role in shaping the counteroffensive. Soviet spies, scouts, and partisan groups operating behind enemy lines provided invaluable details about Axis troop dispositions. They reported how Romanian divisions, poorly equipped with outdated artillery and thin armor support, guarded the northern and southern flanks of the German Sixth Army, Italian and Hungarian units, while Brave lacked the cohesion and heavy weaponry to withstand a determined Soviet assault. Reports confirmed that German commanders had grown complacent, convinced that their allies could hold the lines while the Sixth Army finished crushing Stalingrad's defenders. Soviet aerial reconnaissance flights, carefully planned to avoid detection, photographed trench systems, supply depots, and weak points along the steppe. Even intercepted German communications revealed their overconfidence, as requests for reinforcements were ignored or delayed in favor of focusing on the city itself. To Stavka, the picture was clear. The Germans had built a fortress in Stalingrad, but its walls were guarded by straw. Deception, known by the Russians as Maskirovka, became the silent partner of the coming operation. Soviet engineers built fake airfields, with wooden planes positioned in neat rows to lure German bombers into wasting their sorties. Dummy tanks made of canvas and timber were rolled into position at false assembly areas, convincing Axis intelligence that any Soviet buildup was scattered and unthreatening. Radio deception played its part as well, with entire networks transmitting bogus chatter about reinforcements moving toward Moscow or Leningrad. Meanwhile, actual troop movements toward the Don and steppe regions occurred at night, concealed by strict blackout procedures and camouflage nets stretching across open fields. Rail schedules were manipulated so that armored formations could arrive in staggered waves, avoiding telltale congestion. By the time Soviet armies were in place, the Germans had little inkling of the storm gathering at their flanks. Stalin himself demanded layers of secrecy, so absolute that even many Soviet officers were unaware of the true scale of the plan until the final days before its launch. The scale of the Soviet buildup was staggering, reflecting the industrial might that had been relocated eastward. and restored after the disasters of 1941. Thousands of tanks, many of them T-34s, rumbled across the steppe, their crews hardened from earlier campaigns. Artillery batteries were massed in unprecedented numbers, prepared to unleash barrages that would dwarf anything seen before on the Eastern Front. Cavalry units, still useful in the vast open terrain, were positioned to exploit breakthroughs, while mobile mechanized corps trained relentlessly for rapid encirclement maneuvers. Behind them, infantry divisions dug in, ready to hold captured ground against inevitable counterattacks. Soviet engineers stockpiled pontoon bridges, mine-clearing equipment, and fuel reserves, ensuring that nothing would halt the momentum once the offensive began. Supply depots were secretly filled with ammunition and rations, each hidden under layers of camouflage. The sheer logistics of feeding, arming, and coordinating such an immense force was a triumph of organization under wartime duress. Inside Stavka, debates raged not only about logistics but also about timing. Some generals urged patience, suggesting that the Red Army should wait until the Germans had further exhausted themselves in Stalingrad. Others argued that delay risked the weather closing in, making offensive operations across the steppe treacherous. Stalin, always impatient, pressed for action sooner rather than later, fearing that the Germans might yet capture the city and shift their focus outward. In the end, Zhukov and Vasilevsky persuaded him that mid-November offered the perfect balance, enough time to complete the buildup, yet early enough to strike before the full fury of winter descended. Orders were finalized, code names assigned, and directives issued to fronts across the southern sector. The operation would strike with simultaneous blows from the north and south, meeting west of Stalingrad to encircle the Sixth Army. Operation Uranus, as it was named, became the embodiment of Soviet determination to turn the tide of war. The commanders chosen to lead the spearheads were hardened veterans of the Eastern Front. In the north, General Nikolai Vatutin's southwestern front prepared to drive against Romanian forces near Serafimovich and Kletskaya. In the south, Andrei Yeremenko's Stalingrad front, reinforced by General Konstantin Rokossovsky's Don front, ready to smash through the Romanian Third and Fourth Armies. Coordination between these vast armies demanded constant communication and meticulous synchronization, but Stavka insisted that the element of surprise would amplify Soviet strength. Each general was briefed in secrecy, often within closed sessions where maps were unfurled under dim light and guards stood outside to prevent leaks. Soldiers at the front were told only that offensive operations were planned, not the full scale of what was to come. This veil of mystery maintained morale while keeping the Germans blind to the larger design. Stalin watched closely, his eyes narrowing at every update, knowing that the fate of the Red Army's reputation, and perhaps the survival of the Soviet state, hung on the success of this gamble. By the beginning of November 1942, the Soviet preparations had reached their final stage. The weather turned colder, with frost hardening the steppe and concealing troop movements under morning mist. Soviet propaganda spoke vaguely of resilience and defense, even as entire armies waited in silence for the signal to unleash chaos. German reconnaissance flights continued to report Soviet activity, but dismissed it as routine, blind to the magnitude of what had gathered. Inside the city, German soldiers remained locked in their death struggle among the ruins, oblivious that their fate was being sealed on the flanks. Stavka, for the first time in the war, held not just a defensive shield but an offensive sword, sharpened and ready to strike. On November 19th, the Red Army would ignite Operation Uranus, a counteroffensive designed not merely to relieve Stalingrad, but to annihilate the enemy force trapped within it. The Soviet High Command had taken its time, forged its plan in secrecy, and now prepared to unleash a blow that would alter the course of history. As the German Sixth Army pressed deeper into the ruins of Stalingrad, the wider battlefield revealed a fatal vulnerability that few in Berlin wished to acknowledge. The flanks of the massive German salient along the Don River were not held by hardened Wehrmacht divisions, but by their allies from Hungary, Romania, and Italy. These satellite armies, though brave in spirit, lacked the firepower, equipment, and morale to withstand a determined Soviet blow. They had been stretched thin across hundreds of kilometers of open steppe, their trenches shallow, their defensive works incomplete. Many of their soldiers still wore outdated uniforms and carried rifles from the First World War. Anti-tank weapons were scarce, leaving them defenseless against the Soviet T-34s that prowled the front. German officers often looked down on their allies, assigning them the most exposed sectors while concentrating their own strength in the city. For these men, winter supplies were inadequate, boots were thin, and rations were scarce. Behind their lines, German command promised reinforcements but rarely delivered. The Soviets, watching carefully, saw not just weakness, but opportunity. The Romanian Third Army held the northern flank of Stalingrad, its men arrayed along the banks of the Don River. They faced the daunting task of covering a front far too long for their numbers, leaving dangerous gaps in their defenses. Their artillery was limited in both quantity and quality, often failing to counter Soviet bombardments that softened the ground before attacks. Even worse, they had little protection against tanks, with only a handful of German-supplied anti-tank guns scattered across their line. Soviet intelligence quickly assessed this weakness, noting that these guns could do little against the sloped armor of the T-34. Morale among the Romanians wavered as rumors spread of impending offensives, though Berlin assured them that the Soviets were exhausted. German liaison officers pushed them to hold firm, but the disparity in equipment and training was clear. At night, Soviet patrols slipped across the river, probing the Romanian defenses and reporting back on their fragility. By October 1942, the writing was on the wall, even if many refused to read it. To the south of Stalingrad, the Romanian Fourth Army faced its own daunting challenge, spread thin across the barren steppe. They had little natural cover and relied on shallow trenches for defense. Their soldiers were ill-prepared for the brutal winter that was about to descend, many still wearing summer uniforms. Ammunition shortages meant that they could barely conduct prolonged firefights, leaving them vulnerable to sustained Soviet assaults. German command had promised tanks and Luftwaffe support, but deliveries were sporadic and insufficient. The Romanian divisions were proud but increasingly aware that they had been given an impossible task. German high command, blinded by the obsession with taking Stalingrad, underestimated the danger looming over these exposed troops. Soviet scouts carefully charted their weak points, identifying seams where armored spearheads could punch through. The stage was set for catastrophe, though the Romanians stood dutifully in their positions, unaware of the storm building against them. Their very presence on the steppe would soon become a symbol of sacrifice and neglect. The Hungarian Second Army, positioned further along the Don, faced conditions even harsher. Many Hungarian soldiers were conscripts, with little desire to fight for Hitler's ambitions in Russia. Their equipment was outdated, their supply lines stretched, and their training often inadequate for the demands of modern mechanized warfare. Their tanks, relics of an earlier era, were no match for Soviet armor. Anti-aircraft defenses were minimal, leaving them exposed to Soviet bombing raids that harassed them almost daily. Morale was low, as soldiers questioned why they had been sent to die so far from home. German officers dismissed their complaints, insisting that discipline would hold the line. But behind the facade of order, discontent grew and desertions began to rise. Soviet intelligence intercepted letters home describing hunger, exhaustion, and despair. The weakness of the Hungarian position, like that of the Romanians, became one more gap in a fragile shield that could not withstand the weight of a Soviet hammer. The Italian Eighth Army, deployed along the upper reaches of the Don, struggled under conditions they were never prepared for. Their soldiers, accustomed to Mediterranean climates, were utterly unready for the freezing Russian winter. Their boots disintegrated in the snow, their coats offered little warmth, and frostbite took more men than enemy bullets. Italian artillery pieces, many designed for mountain warfare, proved useless on the vast flatlands of the steppe. Their tanks, light and poorly armored, burned quickly under Soviet fire. Supplies from home were irregular, and what little reached them was often confiscated by German units with higher priority. Discipline eroded as hunger gnawed at morale, and soldiers longed for the comforts of home. Though Italian commanders pleaded for reinforcements, Berlin offered only empty assurances. Soviet reconnaissance identified the Italians as one of the weakest points along the Axis line. When the offensive came, the Italians would be swept aside in a storm they could never hope to resist. The vulnerability of the Axis flanks was not unknown to German generals, yet it was dismissed in favor of the glory promised in Stalingrad. Hitler's obsession with seizing the city blinded him to the looming disaster building outside its walls. Field Marshal Paulus, consumed by the brutal house-to-house fighting, had little time or resources to spare for the flanks. German reserves were committed piecemeal into the urban battle, leaving none available to shore up their allies. Reports from the front warning of Soviet buildups were downplayed or ignored. To Berlin, the weakness of allies was considered manageable, a temporary inconvenience rather than a mortal threat. But in Moscow, Stalin and his generals saw it differently. They saw in these exposed armies the key to unlocking the German grip on Stalingrad. The careful deception operations, Maskirovka, were designed to keep Paulus blind to the preparations. The Germans believed their lines secure, but in truth they rested on crumbling foundations. By November 1942, Soviet preparations were nearly complete, and the Axis flanks were stretched to the breaking point. The Romanians to the north and south, the Hungarians and Italians further along the Don, all bore the brunt of an impossible responsibility. Their casualty rates were already climbing from Soviet raids and the unforgiving climate. Ammunition shortages meant that some units could fire only a few rounds per day. Horses, still relied upon for transport, collapsed in the snow, leaving supply convoys stranded. Winter uniforms arrived too late, or not at all, and soldiers shivered in their foxholes. Soviet propaganda leaflets rained down on them, urging surrender and promising mercy. Many read them with longing, even as they obeyed orders to fight on. These armies were not broken yet, but they stood on the brink. One final push from the Red Army would bring the entire Axis position crashing down. The stage was now set for Operation Uranus, the grand Soviet counteroffensive that would change the course of the war. The weaknesses of the Axis flanks, poorly equipped, poorly supplied, and overstretched, were the soft underbelly of the German position. Soviet planners had studied them with meticulous care, preparing to strike where the enemy was weakest. The Romanians, Hungarians, and Italians stood as thin shields guarding the German Sixth Army's rear. Behind them, Soviet armies massed silently, hidden by deception and camouflage. The Germans in Stalingrad remained locked in brutal combat, unaware that their lifeline was about to be severed. When the blow fell, it would not be gradual but sudden, overwhelming, and devastating. The fate of hundreds of thousands of Axis soldiers hinged on the strength of allies who could not withstand the storm. Their sacrifice, born of neglect and overconfidence, would echo across history as the first cracks in Hitler's Eastern Front. And with those cracks, the tide of the war would begin to turn. The Soviet concept of Maskirovka, or military deception, was an art form perfected long before the winter of 1942. It combined camouflage, misinformation, feints, and the careful manipulation of enemy expectations to create illusions on the battlefield. In the weeks leading up to Operation Uranus, the Soviet High Command applied these principles with meticulous precision. Entire armies were moved across hundreds of kilometers of steppe under the cover of darkness, their tracks concealed and movements disguised. Engineers constructed fake encampments with wooden tanks, dummy artillery, and smoke generators that suggested activity in areas far from the true assembly points. Meanwhile, real units were hidden in forests, ravines, and camouflaged shelters, blending seamlessly into the landscape. Radio deception played a crucial role, with false transmissions sent to convince German intelligence that Soviet strength remained tied up in the city itself. Reconnaissance flights were misled by dummy positions carefully designed to fool aerial photography. The Germans, already overconfident in their intelligence, accepted these illusions as reality. What they failed to see was an immense storm building silently at their flanks. Soviet planners, under the guidance of Zhukov and Vasilevsky, understood that the element of surprise was critical to the success of Uranus. To achieve this, they coordinated a campaign of deception at every level of command. Trains carrying reinforcements often traveled only at night, halting during the day beneath camouflage nets to avoid detection. Soldiers were ordered to avoid lighting fires, even in freezing temperatures, to reduce signs of activity visible to German observers. Vehicles were covered with brush and straw, blending into the frozen steppe like natural formations. Construction noises from real fortifications were drowned out by similar sounds produced in false locations, further confusing enemy scouts. Soviet intelligence operatives leaked misinformation through channels known to be monitored by the Germans, feeding the illusion of weakness and exhaustion. Reports spoke of Soviet divisions too depleted to launch offensives, further lulling the Germans into complacency. Every detail, from the placement of a single tank to the flow of fake radio chatter, was part of a grand orchestration. The deception campaign was not just convincing, it was overwhelming. German reconnaissance was systematically misled by Soviet countermeasures. Luftwaffe pilots, flying over suspected buildup areas, photographed what appeared to be small encampments, poorly armed units, and decoys that reassured them of Soviet weakness. In reality, vast armies lay hidden just beyond their view, covered by camouflage netting so fine it blended seamlessly with the snowy terrain. Soviet engineers excelled at constructing decoys, fake bridges across rivers, phony artillery batteries, and even false airfields that drew German bombs away from real targets. Patrols encountering Soviet defenses often found them thin, reinforcing the notion that Red Army forces were still battered from Stalingrad's brutality. Yet these thin lines were deliberate screens, designed to mask the massing of powerful reserves further behind. The Germans, obsessed with breaking the last Soviet defenses within the city, ignored these anomalies. Reports of suspicious movements were often dismissed as Soviet desperation or bluff. Hitler, convinced that the Red Army had exhausted itself, refused to believe that a large-scale counteroffensive was possible. In this blindness, Soviet deception found its greatest ally. Radio deception formed one of the most intricate elements of Maskirovka. Soviet radio operators maintained transmissions in areas where no real divisions remained, simulating the presence of units that had long since been moved elsewhere. These phantom armies tied down German attention and resources, creating the illusion of strength where none existed. Meanwhile, the actual assault forces maintained strict radio silence, relying on couriers and wired communications to prevent interception. When messages were sent, they were deliberately misleading, pointing to preparations for limited operations rather than a grand offensive. German intelligence analysts, overwhelmed with data, pieced together a picture that matched their expectations rather than the reality. They concluded that Soviet activity on the flanks was defensive, meant only to protect the city itself. Deceptive broadcasts also referenced supply shortages and disciplinary problems, further selling the illusion of weakness. This calculated misinformation reinforced Hitler's belief that the Soviets were incapable of large-scale maneuvers. In truth, those very maneuvers were already in motion. The Soviets also exploited the arrogance of the German high command. German generals often underestimated their enemies, dismissing Soviet ingenuity as crude and unsophisticated. This bias blinded them to the effectiveness of Maskirovka, even when evidence hinted at larger movements. German intelligence assumed that the Soviets, having suffered such massive losses, lacked the resources to rebuild quickly. Reports of fresh Soviet divisions arriving on the front were dismissed as exaggerations or propaganda. When prisoners were interrogated, their claims of vast reserves were brushed aside as lies. The Germans trusted their assumptions more than the fragmented intelligence they received. This overconfidence dovetailed perfectly with the Soviet deception effort, which reinforced what the Germans already believed. In effect, the Red Army did not need to erase German doubts. It only needed to feed their existing illusions. That psychological edge made Maskirovka devastatingly effective. Camouflage on a massive scale turned the steppe into a theater of illusions. Soviet units used nets, paint, and natural foliage to disguise thousands of vehicles and artillery pieces. From the air, camouflaged tanks looked like farmhouses, while artillery positions appeared as haystacks. Bridges were concealed beneath coverings that mimicked ice, allowing supplies to move across rivers unnoticed. Even the smoke of campfires was redirected through underground chimneys to disperse harmlessly away from observation points. Soviet engineers perfected the art of misdirection, making the strongest forces invisible until the very moment of attack. Meanwhile, false construction sites and decoy troop concentrations drew German reconnaissance like moths to a flame. This constant diversion ensured that German intelligence remained focused on phantom threats. Behind the veil of illusions, real Soviet armies gathered in silence, poised for the blow. By the time the Germans realized the truth, it would be far too late. Deception extended beyond the battlefield into the realm of diplomacy and strategy. Soviet propaganda publicly emphasized the sacrifices in Stalingrad, painting a picture of desperation and defense rather than preparation for counterattack. Foreign journalists, allowed limited access, reported on Soviet suffering but saw nothing of the massive buildup further behind. The Western Allies, too, were kept largely in the dark, though they were impressed by the Soviets' resilience. German spies attempting to gather information found themselves fed carefully curated details that reinforced false narratives. Meanwhile, Soviet partisan activity behind German lines created chaos that further confused the picture. Bridges were blown, supply lines harassed, and rumors spread of new offensives in sectors far from Stalingrad. This strategic fog ensured that when Operation Uranus finally struck, it would be seen not as a predictable move, but as a shocking reversal. The deception campaign blurred the line between truth and illusion. In that blur, the Soviets found their decisive advantage. By November 1942, Maskirovka had achieved its purpose, The Germans were blind to the scale and direction of the coming Soviet blow. Paulus and his Sixth Army remained locked in savage combat inside Stalingrad, confident that their flanks were secure under the care of their allies. Hitler, convinced of Soviet weakness, refused to shift reserves away from the city. The German High Command operated in a manufactured reality, one designed and perfected by Soviet deception. Behind this curtain of illusions, over 1 million Soviet soldiers, thousands of tanks, and endless artillery batteries stood ready. The Red Army had concealed its strength with such mastery that the offensive would arrive like a thunderclap in clear skies. When the first shells fell, and the armoured spearhead surged forward, the Germans would realize the terrible truth. Their enemies had not been broken. They had been waiting. Operation Uranus was about to shatter the illusion, and with it the myth of German invincibility. The deception had done its work, and now the reckoning would begin. The Soviet counteroffensive, codenamed Operation Uranus, would not have been possible without the extraordinary buildup of men and material that took place in the months leading up to November 1942. While the German Sixth Army fought for every street in Stalingrad, far from the city, the Soviet Union gathered its striking force in utmost secrecy. Trains thundered across the breadth of the Soviet Union, carrying divisions from the Urals, Siberia, and Central Asia to the steppe around the Don. These were no ordinary reinforcements. They were hardened, battle-tested formations, many of them acclimated to brutal winter warfare. The High Command, or Stavka, directed a concentration of forces on a scale that had rarely been seen before in modern warfare. Whole tank armies, equipped with the reliable and deadly T-34 SES, were assembled behind the thinly held lines opposite Axis satellite armies. Alongside them came fresh infantry divisions, well supplied and reinforced, unlike the battered troops still holding on in the ruins of Stalingrad. The Soviets were not simply preparing to push back, they were preparing to annihilate, and as their strength mounted day by day, the German forces remained unaware of the storm that was gathering. The logistics of this operation were staggering, stretching the Soviet transportation system to its absolute limits. Railways became arteries of war, pumping men, tanks, artillery, ammunition, and supplies from the Soviet heartland to the front. Each train carried dozens of flat cars loaded with T-34 SES, Katyusha rocket launchers, and crates of shells carefully concealed beneath camouflage to deceive Luftwaffe reconnaissance. Workers and partisans along the routes labored around the clock, repairing tracks, clearing snow, and ensuring that the supply flow never faltered. In staging areas, hundreds of kilometers behind the lines, depots overflowed with equipment, spare tank parts, winter uniforms, and food rations. The Red Army's quartermasters knew that sustaining the offensive would require enormous stockpiles. Fuel, in particular, was hoarded in vast quantities, for the mechanized thrusts would be fuel-hungry. Horse-drawn carts supplemented motor transport, carrying supplies across terrain where trucks could not pass. This colossal logistical build-up was carefully synchronized, each movement timed to deliver maximum impact at the moment of attack. The very scale of the undertaking demonstrated how far the Soviet war machine had recovered since the disasters of 1941. The core of the Soviet striking force was its armored power, concentrated in shock armies designed to punch through the Axis lines. The T-34 medium tank formed the backbone of these armored formations, its sloped armor and 76 mm gun proving devastating against German and Axis counterparts. Alongside the T-34, Sevier KV tanks added brute force, while lighter models provided speed and reconnaissance. Tank brigades were reinforced with self-propelled guns and motorized infantry, creating combined arms units capable of independent action. Supporting this armored fist were waves of artillery, field guns, howitzers, and the terrifying Katyusha rocket launchers, whose shrieking salvos could devastate enemy morale before the tanks even moved. Soviet doctrine emphasized overwhelming firepower, and artillery concentrations were planned to blast open corridors for armored exploitation. Entire artillery divisions were assembled, with guns wheel-to-wheel across the steppe. The Red Air Force prepared to provide cover, though weather often grounded planes, leaving the burden of destruction to ground forces. This combination of armor and artillery would give the Soviets the sledgehammer they needed to smash through the Axis flanks. Every detail pointed to a strategy of total destruction rather than incremental gain. The infantry formed the backbone of the striking force, and here the Soviet buildup reached staggering proportions. Entire armies were transferred from quiet sectors or rebuilt from reserves, their divisions filled out with fresh recruits, convalescent veterans, and experienced cadres. These men were given winter uniforms, felt boots, and supplies designed for the brutal cold, ensuring they could endure the conditions far better than their German and Axis counterparts. Siberian divisions, battle-hardened and renowned for their ferocity, were among those deployed to the steppe. They brought with them not only fighting skill, but also a psychological edge, for their presence symbolized the Red Army's unbroken strength. Engineers accompanied the infantry, tasked with building pontoon bridges, clearing minefields, and ensuring that supply lines could keep up with advancing troops. Cavalry units were also deployed, their speed and maneuverability suited to exploitation in the vast open steppe once the front lines were broken. Each division was reinforced with mortars, machine guns, and anti-tank rifles, ensuring that they could fight independently if cut off. The Soviets planned for depth, with successive echelons ready to exploit initial breakthroughs. This layering of forces meant the offensive would have staying power once it began. Behind this massive concentration of manpower and machinery was the iron will of the Soviet High Command. Stalin, though cautious, after earlier disasters, placed enormous trust in the plans of Zhukov and Vasilevsky, who had orchestrated the build-up with clinical precision. Their strategy required immense coordination between fronts, with multiple armies striking in unison from different directions. To achieve this, they established strict timetables, synchronization of artillery barrages, and clear lines of communication between commanders. Secrecy remained paramount. Only a handful of officers knew the full scope of the operation. Orders were often delivered by hand rather than radio, minimizing the risk of German interception. The commanders drilled their troops relentlessly, rehearsing assault tactics and combined arms coordination. Morale was boosted through speeches, propaganda, and reminders of the horrors the Germans had inflicted on Soviet soil. Soldiers were told that this was not only a battle for victory, but also for revenge and survival. In the minds of many, the upcoming offensive was nothing less than a reckoning for the suffering of their homeland. The Soviet buildup extended far beyond men and weapons. It encompassed the very infrastructure of the front. Field hospitals were prepared in advance to handle the tidal wave of casualties that would inevitably come. Ammunition depots were established close enough to the front to allow for rapid resupply, but hidden well enough to avoid German detection. Communication lines were strengthened, with miles of telephone wire laid across the steppe, often buried underground to protect against shelling. Fuel dumps were dispersed to prevent catastrophic losses if one was discovered. Even small details such as the preparation of sleds for winter transport or the stockpiling of spare skis were carefully considered. Logistics officers calculated not only how to launch the offensive, but how to sustain it over weeks of brutal fighting. Partisans operating behind German lines were instructed to disrupt enemy railways, ensuring that Axis reinforcements would struggle to respond. Every aspect of the Red Army's preparations reflected a level of maturity and organization that had been absent during the chaotic retreats of 1941. The Soviet war machine was no longer reactive, it was now proactive and deadly. The atmosphere among the Soviet troops gathering for the offensive was a mixture of exhaustion, anticipation, and grim determination. Many had fought through the worst months of 1942, watching comrades fall in droves while holding the line around Stalingrad. Now, for the first time, they sensed that the initiative was shifting in their favor. Officers spoke of a great encirclement, of cutting off the German Sixth Army and delivering a blow from which Hitler's forces might never recover. Propaganda emphasized the historic nature of the coming battle, framing it as a decisive moment in the war for the motherland. Soldiers wrote letters home, some filled with hope, others with the resignation of men who knew they might not return. They were drilled not just in tactics but in discipline, for the success of such a massive operation required unity and precision. Across the frozen steppe, men huddled in foxholes and tents, their breath steaming in the night, waiting for the signal. The buildup was not only physical but psychological, forging a sense of destiny among the troops. They were about to be the hammer that would smash the invader. By mid-November 1942, the Soviet striking force was in place, hidden and ready. To the Germans, it appeared that the Soviets were clinging desperately to the ruins of Stalingrad, pouring their strength into the city itself. In reality, three massive fronts, southwest, Don, and Stalingrad, were poised to strike from the north, west, and south, converging on the overextended Axis flanks. Behind them, reserves were ready to exploit success, ensuring that the offensive would not stall after the initial breakthrough. The concentration of tanks, artillery, and infantry was unprecedented in the theater, surpassing even the scale of the German summer offensives. Soviet commanders knew they had achieved surprise, and that the Germans remained blind to the danger. The final days before the assault were filled with tense anticipation, as every man and machine took its place. The deception of Maskirovka had hidden the build-up brilliantly, leaving the Germans complacent. When the first guns opened fire, it would not be a skirmish but an avalanche. The Soviet striking force, patiently assembled, was now ready to unleash its fury. As November 18, 1942, gave way to night, the vast steppes around Stalingrad fell under an icy silence, broken only by the crunch of boots on frost and the muffled sounds of soldiers trying to stay warm. The temperature plunged, coating the barren land with a cruel, crystalline frost that glittered under the pale moonlight. Along the German positions, soldiers of the Sixth Army huddled in shallow trenches, their coats threadbare and their rations dwindling, utterly unaware of the storm that was gathering beyond the horizon. Many believed the front had settled into a grinding stalemate, the brutal fighting inside Stalingrad itself consuming most of the Wehrmacht's attention. Yet in the darkness, beyond the river lines and frozen fields, Soviet troops massed silently, their presence hidden by careful deception. The cold air carried the faint smell of smoke from burned villages, reminders of the devastation that had swept the region for months. Horses stamped nervously, sensing something unnatural in the stillness of the night. Soviet officers walked quietly through assembly zones, whispering last-minute instructions. That night, both sides waited, though only one knew what dawn would bring. Inside German command posts, the mood was a mixture of fatigue, arrogance, and overconfidence. General Friedrich Paulus, overseeing the Sixth Army, received reports that the Romanian and Hungarian allies were uneasy, worried about possible Soviet movements. Yet Paulus and many within the German staff dismissed these concerns, believing the Red Army too depleted to launch a serious offensive. Their maps showed Soviet formations scattered and weakened, still locked in the urban inferno of Stalingrad, Few German officers realized that the Soviets had deliberately hidden the massive concentration of troops poised to strike. That night, Paulus reviewed reports by candlelight, convinced that the coming days would bring nothing more than continued house-to-house fighting in the city. He trusted Hitler's insistence that Stalingrad must fall, and that the Soviets could do little but bleed themselves dry. The Wehrmacht intelligence underestimated both Soviet planning and Soviet will. As Paulus retired to his quarters, he unknowingly carried with him a false sense of security. The Soviet camp, in contrast, was alive with controlled tension and disciplined anticipation. In fields camouflaged with branches and painted tarps, tanks stood ready, their engines silent but primed for ignition at dawn. Artillery batteries were carefully positioned under cover of night, their barrels trained on Romanian and German lines. Soldiers of the Red Army, many of them hardened Siberians and veterans of previous fronts, crouched beside their rifles and waited for orders. Commissars gave hushed speeches, reminding men of the stakes, the liberation of their homeland, revenge for atrocities, and the turning of the tide in the great patriotic war. Men scribbled letters to loved ones in the flickering glow of lanterns, knowing some would never see another sunrise. Supply officers distributed vodka rations, not as celebration, but as a means to steel nerves before battle. At command headquarters, Zhukov and Vasilevsky coordinated final details through secure lines, ensuring that the strike would fall with precision. For the Red Army, the night was not one of sleep but of readiness. The weather itself seemed to foreshadow the violence that was about to unfold. Bitter winds swept across the steppe, slicing through the thin uniforms of Axis soldiers and stinging exposed skin. Snow flurries drifted lazily at first, settling into trenches and covering weapons with a thin white blanket. By midnight the ground was frozen solid, ensuring that the heavy tanks of the Soviets would not sink into mud, but roll forward with crushing inevitability. For the Germans, who had grown accustomed to brutal fighting within the ruins of Stalingrad, the outer defences along the Don River felt secondary, an afterthought. For the Romanians holding vast stretches of the line, the cold only added to their misery, highlighting shortages of proper winter gear and ammunition. Horses pulled thinly supplied wagons across icy paths, their breath forming clouds in the night air. The environment was merciless, favoring those who had prepared for endurance over those clinging to complacency. The land itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the eruption to come. In the trenches of the Romanian Third Army, morale wavered dangerously low. Soldiers shared rumors of massive Soviet concentrations, but their German overseers dismissed such reports as exaggerations. Equipment was inadequate. Many carried obsolete rifles with only a handful of anti-tank guns scattered along the frozen line. Their uniforms were ragged and food supplies meager, with thin soups and stale bread barely keeping hunger at bay. At night they wrapped themselves in horse blankets, shivering against the cutting winds. Officers tried to maintain discipline, but the sense of vulnerability was palpable. Some men whispered prayers, others wrote desperate notes home, fearing they would never escape the steppe alive. Their fears were not unfounded. Soviet reconnaissance units had already marked weak points along their positions, preparing to punch through with overwhelming force. To the Romanians, the silence of the night carried a dreadful weight. They sensed what their German allies could not, that the front was fragile, and catastrophe loomed just beyond the darkness. Within Stalingrad itself, the night carried a different rhythm of horror. German units inside the city remained locked in savage combat with Soviet defenders, trading buildings and factories in relentless assaults. Fires burned in the distance, casting an eerie orange glow over the skeletal ruins. Civilians trapped in the rubble, huddled in cellars, starving, freezing, and terrified, caught between two armies. The German soldiers, exhausted from months of urban warfare, longed for relief that never came. Supplies had to be dragged in under fire, and every street crossing meant risking death from snipers or mortars. Soviet defenders inside the city, though equally exhausted, had been told to hold at any cost, knowing that relief was on its way. They fought with grim determination, aware that their sacrifices were part of a larger plan unfolding beyond the city limits. In Stalingrad that night, the war seemed eternal, but in the fields to the north and south, change was only hours away. Soviet officers moved tirelessly between units, checking maps, confirming positions, and ensuring coordination among infantry, armor, and artillery. Radio silence was maintained to avoid detection, but messengers carried vital orders by foot or horseback. Engineers worked feverishly to strengthen bridges across rivers and prepare supply routes for the surge of troops. Camouflage nets concealed fuel dumps and ammunition stores, vital lifelines for the offensive. The Soviet command left nothing to chance, rehearsing the timing of artillery barrages down to the minute. To the soldiers, this attention to detail instilled confidence, a belief that the Red Army was no longer the disorganized force of 1941, but a disciplined, formidable machine. Even the youngest recruits sensed the gravity of the coming dawn. They were not just holding the line, but preparing to strike back at the invader with unprecedented force. Their leaders had told them tomorrow would be the day they began to change the course of the war. As midnight passed, and the early hours of November 19th crept closer, the world on the steppe seemed unnaturally still. Fires smoldered low in German and Romanian camps, men too tired or too cold to speak much above a whisper. In Soviet assembly areas, soldiers adjusted bayonets, checked ammunition, and crouched beside their weapons, waiting for the signal. Above them, the stars glittered in the frozen sky, indifferent to the human drama about to erupt. The landscape was poised between two realities, the illusion of calm and the certainty of chaos. Within hours, thunder would roll across the steppe, not from the sky, but from thousands of artillery barrels. The soldiers who lay awake that night, whether German, Romanian, or Soviet, could not escape the tension pressing on every breath. For some, it was the last night they would ever see. For others, it was the threshold of history. The storm of Operation Uranus was about to break. At precisely 7:20 a.m. on November 19th, 1942, the frozen silence of the steppe shattered with a roar that seemed to split the earth itself. The Soviet artillery, positioned in secrecy for weeks, unleashed one of the most concentrated bombardments of the entire war. Thousands of guns opened fire simultaneously, their barrels belching flame and smoke in a relentless synchronized rhythm. Shells rained down upon the Romanian Third Army's positions, tearing trenches apart, igniting supply dumps, and obliterating communication lines. The icy ground quaked under the sheer force of the barrage, as though nature itself had joined the Soviet assault. Romanian soldiers, caught in shallow defenses, clutched their helmets in terror, many unable to respond before death found them in blinding flashes. The bombardment was not random, it was mapped with precision, saturating command posts, artillery emplacements, and key defensive strongpoints. German observers, positioned further back, could scarcely comprehend the scale of destruction unfolding before them. In that single moment, the illusion of Axis security along the Don River evaporated. The artillery fire lasted for nearly 80 minutes, a ceaseless thunder that seemed designed not merely to destroy, but to paralyze. Entire sections of the Romanian front dissolved into chaos, with survivors staggering through smoke and debris, blinded and deafened. Barbed wire was shredded, bunkers collapsed, and frozen soil erupted into fountains of mud and snow. Horses bolted wildly from shattered stables, adding to the confusion as they trampled fleeing soldiers. Romanian commanders tried desperately to send signals to German headquarters, but telephone lines lay in ruins, cut in the first minutes of the barrage. Where radios still worked, the crackling voices carried panic more than discipline. Soviet spotters adjusted the fire methodically, ensuring that no pocket of resistance remained untouched. Some shells carried leaflets, taunting the defenders with promises of destruction and Soviet vengeance. By the time the guns finally fell silent, the defenders were broken in spirit, even before the first Soviet tank advanced. It was a symphony of fire, calculated to erase the front line in one morning. The ground assault followed swiftly, almost seamlessly, as waves of Soviet infantry surged forward across the frost-hardened steppe. Behind them came tanks. Sleek T-30 force-painted in white camouflage, their turrets bristling with confidence. Soviet soldiers charged through the smoke, shouting battle cries that merged with the growl of engines and the clatter of machine guns. The Romanian defenders, reeling from the bombardment, fired sporadically, their rifles and light artillery pitiful against the armored tide. Anti-tank weapons were scarce, and those few that existed often misfired in the cold, or were destroyed before they could be brought to bear. Soviet artillery shifted its fire deeper into the rear, smashing roads and bridges to prevent reinforcements. Within hours, breaches appeared along a front that had seemed solid only a day before. Entire Romanian regiments collapsed, retreating in disorder or being encircled where they stood. The Soviet advance was so rapid that many defenders were overwhelmed without even firing a shot. The offensive was unfolding exactly as planned. In the northern sector, General Vatutin's forces struck the Romanian Third Army with devastating coordination. Soviet cavalry units galloped behind the armored columns, cutting off retreat routes and overrunning artillery positions. Infantry squads used grenades and submachine guns to clear trenches, advancing with ruthless efficiency. Romanian officers tried to rally their men, but panic spread faster than discipline. The memory of the bombardment still seared into their minds. Survivors often dropped their weapons and fled, leaving heavy equipment abandoned in the snow. Soviet tank crews pushed forward relentlessly, crushing barbed wire under treads and ignoring sporadic resistance. Within hours, villages and crossroads once thought secure by the Axis were in Soviet hands. A front that had stretched for miles was now riddled with gaps wide enough for entire Soviet divisions to pour through. Reports filtered back to Paulus's headquarters, each one darker than the last. Yet at first, German command refused to believe the full scale of the disaster unfolding. In the southern sector, the assault was no less overwhelming. General Yeremenko's Stalingrad front launched its attack with equal ferocity, supported by armored spearheads and massed infantry. The Romanian Fourth Army, ill-equipped and poorly prepared, collapsed under the first wave. Many of its soldiers had no winter clothing, no adequate artillery, and no reserves to fall back on. Soviet tanks smashed through their positions, supported by Katyusha rocket barrages that turned defensive lines into fiery ruins. The steppe echoed with the scream of rockets and the thunder of advancing armor. Axis soldiers fled in all directions, some attempting to regroup, others simply vanishing into the white haze of snow and smoke. German liaison officers on the scene sent frantic reports, warning that the flank was disintegrating, but higher command remained skeptical, convinced these were exaggerated accounts. In reality, the collapse of the southern flank was as complete as in the north, setting the stage for the encirclement to come. For the Soviet troops advancing across the shattered lines, the morning of November 19th carried a sense of destiny. Soldiers pressed forward with adrenaline-fueled determination, many shouting for the motherland as they charged into enemy positions. Commissars reminded them that they were avenging comrades lost at Moscow, Leningrad, and within the ruins of Stalingrad itself. The coordination between tanks, artillery, and infantry was unlike anything seen from the Red Army in previous campaigns. Where once Soviet offensives had stumbled in confusion, now they advanced like a machine, each part reinforcing the other. Engineers followed close behind, repairing bridges and clearing obstacles to keep the offensive momentum unbroken. Medical units moved with the tide, tending to the wounded on the spot, so that fighting strength remained high. The Red Army was no longer merely reacting to the German invasion, it was seizing the initiative with overwhelming force. For those on the steppe that day, it felt as though history itself was tilting. As the day wore on, entire Axis divisions ceased to exist in any meaningful form. Romanian units dissolved into scattered remnants, many of them surrendering en masse. Columns of prisoners trudged back toward Soviet lines, their weapons and equipment abandoned on the frozen ground. Soviet soldiers marveled at the amount of captured material, artillery, rifles, machine guns, and even intact vehicles. The battlefield was littered with burning wagons, broken helmets, and shattered bodies. Survivors spoke of the attack as an apocalypse, a storm of fire and steel against which they had no defense. German officers tried desperately to stabilize the situation by shifting reserves, but there were few troops available and none in sufficient strength to counter the Soviet thrusts. Paulus's headquarters received conflicting reports, some downplaying the danger, others crying catastrophe. Yet the reality was already clear: the Axis flanks had crumbled beyond repair. The day belonged entirely to the Red Army. By nightfall on November 19th, the Soviet advance had penetrated deep into the Romanian Third Army's sector, leaving the German Sixth Army dangerously exposed. The offensive had achieved in one day what planners had dreamed of for months, shattering the enemy's weakest points and opening a path to encirclement. Fires burned across the steppe, casting an ominous glow on the horizon as Soviet columns pressed forward into the night. Exhausted soldiers warmed themselves beside captured supplies, eating Axis rations with grim satisfaction. The Red Army's commanders, though pleased, knew the battle was far from over. Tomorrow the offensive would continue, pushing deeper toward the Volga and cutting off the German lifeline. But on this first day, the balance of power on the Eastern Front had shifted irreversibly. The once invincible Wehrmacht now found its flanks bleeding, broken, and unable to withstand the Soviet tide. The storm of Operation Uranus had begun, and it was only gathering strength. The morning of November 20th, 1942, revealed the full extent of the devastation inflicted on the Axis flanks. The Romanian Third Army in the north and the Romanian Fourth Army in the south were no longer coherent fighting forces, but fragmented collections of shattered battalions, cut-off regiments, and terrified men fleeing in every direction. Soviet spearheads poured into the breaches, their tanks rumbling forward across the snow-choked steppe with unstoppable momentum. Horses, wagons, and artillery pieces littered the landscape, abandoned in desperate haste as Romanian units dissolved under pressure. German liaison officers attached to these formations sent frantic telegrams, reporting that entire divisions had ceased to exist within a single day. Yet their messages were met with disbelief at higher command, where Paulus and his staff clung to the illusion of temporary setbacks. The stark reality was that the Red Army had smashed open both doors of the German fortress at Stalingrad, and the Sixth Army's position was now dangerously exposed. Romanian soldiers who survived the initial onslaught spoke of the terror of Soviet artillery and the futility of their resistance. Many had been armed with obsolete weapons, sometimes dating back to the First World War, which proved useless against the armoured T-34 Sears that now rolled through their lines. Winter uniforms were scarce, leaving men in tattered coats, shivering and starving as they tried to stand against a mechanized tide. In some cases, entire companies surrendered without firing a shot, preferring captivity to certain death. Officers attempted to rally their men with threats and pleas, but the collapse of morale was irreversible. Columns of prisoners trudged westward under Soviet guard, while stragglers attempted to escape on foot across the frozen plains. Communication with German headquarters disintegrated as telephones lay severed and radios failed under bombardment. By midday, German intelligence officers could not even locate the remnants of the armies they were supposed to be supporting. The collapse was absolute, swift, and merciless. The Italian Eighth Army, positioned further west along the Don, also faced the ripple effect of Soviet pressure. Though not struck directly in the initial assault, its exposed position quickly became untenable as neighboring Romanian forces disintegrated. Italian officers, aware of their poor equipment and inadequate winter gear, dreaded the inevitable moment when Soviet armor would turn against them. Their soldiers were poorly trained for mechanized warfare and relied heavily on German support that no longer existed. As rumors of disaster spread from the Romanian front, Italian morale crumbled even before the Soviet thrust reached their lines. Entire units abandoned their posts, retreating in disorder and clogging the frozen roads with men, mules, and broken vehicles. German commanders attempted to redirect Italian divisions to form a new line of defense, but these improvisations only added to the chaos. The collapse of one flank became contagious, infecting every segment of the overstretched Axis line. For the German Sixth Army, positioned deep inside Stalingrad, the sudden disintegration of its supporting allies created a crisis of communication and awareness. Reports arrived piecemeal, often hours late, describing catastrophic losses that Paulus and his staff struggled to comprehend. Maps that once showed neat front lines now bore scribbled arrows and circles, indicating Soviet breakthroughs racing westward. Supply routes that had seemed secure the day before were suddenly threatened or cut entirely. In headquarters, officers debated whether the Romanian collapse was temporary or irreversible, with some insisting reinforcements could stabilize the situation. Yet reinforcements were nowhere to be found, and the Luftwaffe could not possibly make up for the loss of ground transport. The German Sixth Army, still locked in brutal urban combat in Stalingrad itself, now stood on the brink of isolation without even realizing it. The collapse of the flanks was not just a setback, it was the prelude to encirclement. Chaos reigned across the battlefield as Axis forces attempted desperate retreats. Romanian and Italian soldiers fled in disorganized columns, only to be overrun by Soviet cavalry or cut down by strafing aircraft. Frozen rivers became scenes of carnage as retreating troops clogged crossings, turning bridges into death traps under artillery fire. German officers tried to redirect the fleeing masses, but their orders went unheard amidst the thunder of Soviet tank engines and the screams of retreating men. Trucks jammed the few available roads, many breaking down in the freezing cold, forcing soldiers to abandon supplies and march on foot. Artillery pieces were spiked or left behind, entire depots looted by advancing Soviet infantry. The retreat was not orderly, but panicked, a collapse of discipline that reflected the hopelessness of the situation. In the space of 48 hours, what had once been a cohesive front line dissolved into chaos, exposing the German Sixth Army's flanks completely. The Wehrmacht's reliance on its Axis allies now revealed itself as a fatal weakness. While German divisions in Stalingrad fought with determination and skill, Their entire strategic position depended on Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian formations, holding the vast northern and southern flanks. These armies had long been considered second-rate, given inferior equipment and little training for modern mechanized war. German High Command had ignored their pleas for better weapons and winter supplies, assuming they could hold their sectors through sheer numbers. Now that illusion lay in ruins, as the Soviet offensive tore through them like paper. Paulus's Sixth Army was left exposed on both sides, surrounded by enemies advancing with speed and coordination. What had once seemed like a fortress of German strength on the Volga was now becoming a trap. The collapse of the flanks was not just the defeat of Allies, it was the unraveling of Hitler's grand plan for the East. As Soviet forces advanced deeper, they exploited the disarray with ruthless precision. Tanks and motorized infantry bypassed pockets of resistance, leaving them to be mopped up later, while spearheads pushed toward key road junctions and river crossings. Cavalry units harried retreating Axis soldiers, capturing thousands in a matter of hours. Soviet propaganda units distributed leaflets urging surrender, promising fair treatment, and reminding Axis soldiers that their cause was hopeless. In the rear, chaos among Axis headquarters grew unbearable. German officers argued over whether to attempt immediate counterattacks or withdraw entirely from Stalingrad. Messages from Paulus became increasingly desperate, yet Berlin remained firm that no retreat was permitted. Stalin's generals knew they had achieved the breakthrough they had planned so carefully. Every hour, the noose around the German Sixth Army drew tighter. By the night of November 20th, the Eastern Front had transformed beyond recognition. Fires burned across the steppe, where depots and convoys had been destroyed, casting eerie glows into the winter darkness. Axis soldiers huddled in the snow, lost and leaderless, while Soviet armor pressed forward with unstoppable determination. German command posts buzzed with confusion, their maps rendered meaningless by Soviet advances that outpaced every estimate. The collapse of the flanks had opened the way for encirclement, though many within the Sixth Army did not yet grasp their fate. Paulus's men in Stalingrad continued to fight street by street, unaware that the ground beneath their comrades outside the city had already given way. For the Soviets, victory was no longer a hope but a momentum that carried them forward relentlessly. The collapse of the flanks was not the end of the battle, but it was the beginning of the Sixth Army's doom. The collapse of the Romanian armies had left two vast corridors open on the northern and southern flanks of the German Sixth Army, and the Soviets wasted no time in exploiting them. From the north, General Rokossovsky's Don front poured armored and mechanized forces southward, their T-34 tanks moving in columns across the snowbound steppe. From the south, General Eremenko's Stalingrad front unleashed the 51st and 57th Armies, driving north with equal ferocity. The operation was unfolding exactly as Zhukov and Vasilevsky had envisioned during their secret Stavka meetings, two great jaws of steel sweeping toward one another to encircle Paulus's forces. Soviet commanders maintained relentless pressure, refusing to allow the Axis defenders time to regroup or dig new lines. Infantry followed close behind the tanks, seizing villages and crossroads in rapid succession. German and Romanian stragglers were swept aside or taken prisoner, their resistance collapsing under the sheer scale of the advance. The Soviet Pincer, vast and inexorable, was beginning to close around Stalingrad. The speed of the Soviet advance stunned German commanders, who still clung to the hope of containing the breakthrough. Entire Soviet tank corps raced forward at a pace of 20 to 30 kilometers a day, far beyond what German intelligence had anticipated. Cavalry units galloped alongside armored columns, exploiting gaps and hunting down retreating troops. The terrain itself seemed to aid the attackers. Frozen ground allowed heavy vehicles to move swiftly across open plains, while snowstorms masked their movements from Axis reconnaissance. Soviet artillery, mounted on mobile platforms, fired continuously in support, reducing villages into rubble before German rear guards could mount any defense. For Paulus's Sixth Army, locked in brutal combat inside Stalingrad, the thunder of artillery on the horizon signaled a calamity that was rapidly approaching but still poorly understood. What seemed at first like localized enemy thrusts was now revealing itself as a vast coordinated operation with one deadly aim: encirclement. On November 21st, the Soviet pincers reached critical momentum, with spearheads advancing toward the town of Kalek on the Don River. Kalek was not merely a name on the map, it was the vital bridgehead and supply hub linking the German Sixth Army in Stalingrad to the outside world. Its capture would sever the last lifeline of the army and complete the trap. Soviet tank brigades drove relentlessly westward toward Kalek from both directions, bypassing isolated resistance to maintain speed. German units rushed to reinforce the town, but most were remnants of shattered divisions, unable to stand against Soviet armor. The Soviets deployed engineer units to secure crossings, ensuring that no escape route remained open. Villages along the road to Kalek fell one by one, their garrisons overwhelmed or fleeing in panic. Every kilometer gained brought the pincers closer together, and by nightfall the jaws were only hours from snapping shut. The Germans attempted to mount desperate counterattacks to relieve the pressure, but these efforts were doomed from the start. Hastily gathered panzer battle groups, drawn from scattered units, lacked the numbers and fuel to sustain operations. Soviet tank brigades, fresh and well supplied, smashed through these improvised defenses with brutal efficiency. Air support, once a trump card for the Wehrmacht, faltered as the Luftwaffe struggled with poor weather, overstretched resources, and Soviet fighter resistance. In the confusion, entire German battalions were encircled and annihilated in place. Reports flowed back to Paulus's headquarters, describing armored columns racing deep behind the lines, but Paulus remained fixated on the battle inside Stalingrad itself. Meanwhile, Hitler in distant Rastenburg refused to permit withdrawal, insisting that the Sixth Army hold its ground. These fatal decisions allowed the Soviets to press forward unopposed, driving the jaws of their great pincer closer together with every passing hour. Inside Stalingrad, German soldiers remained unaware of the full scope of the disaster unfolding beyond the city. For them, the war was still the hell of ruined factories, broken buildings, and endless street fighting. Yet whispers of Soviet breakthroughs reached them through exhausted couriers and wounded survivors arriving from the flanks. Officers reassured their men that reinforcements were on the way, and that the Romanian collapse was being handled. In reality, there were no reinforcements, and the flanks were already gone. Soviet artillery fire echoed closer, and columns of smoke rising from the steppe suggested massive battles raging beyond the Volga. What seemed like a distant crisis was in fact an encirclement operation unfolding at breathtaking speed. The German Sixth Army, numbering over 250,000 men, continued fighting in the ruins without realizing that the walls of their fortress were closing in around them. The Soviet commanders demonstrated remarkable coordination as their armies advanced. Communication lines functioned with precision, relaying updated positions and orders to maintain the pincer's momentum. Logistics officers ensured fuel and ammunition kept pace with the forward units, even as temperatures plunged below freezing. Political officers rode alongside commanders, reminding soldiers of the significance of the operation. Stalingrad was not only about defending the motherland, but about striking a decisive blow against Hitler's invasion. Villagers in liberated towns greeted Soviet troops with tears, bread, and salt, though many settlements had been devastated by Axis occupation. Soviet soldiers, hardened by years of retreat, sensed that the tide of war was finally turning in their favor. The closing of the Pincer was more than a tactical maneuver. It was the beginning of vengeance for the scorched earth, the massacres, and the humiliation endured since 1941. By November 22nd, Soviet spearheads were within striking distance of Kalag itself. The 4th Tank Corps and 26th Tank Corps pushed relentlessly forward, their treads grinding through snow and mud, their guns blasting apart scattered German roadblocks. As dawn broke, Soviet reconnaissance reported the outlines of the bridges at Kalag on the horizon. German defenders, hastily assembled from rear units, attempted to hold the crossings, but they were hopelessly outnumbered and outgunned. Soviet assault troops stormed the town, engaging in fierce house-to-house combat reminiscent of Stalingrad itself, though on a smaller scale. Within hours, Soviet tanks broke through and secured the bridges, cutting the last artery connecting the Sixth Army to the outside. The capture of Kalag has sealed Paulus's fate. The two great pincers had met, and the encirclement of Stalingrad was now a reality. The tightening of the Soviet pincer was a turning point, not only for the battle, but for the entire war on the Eastern Front. The German Sixth Army, once the pride of Hitler's campaign in the East, was now cut off from supply, reinforcements, and retreat. Over 250,000 men were trapped in a frozen cauldron, surrounded on all sides by determined Soviet forces. Panic spread through Axis command structures as the realization of encirclement set in, yet Hitler refused to authorize a breakout. For the Soviets, the successful convergence at Kalag marked the triumph of careful planning, secrecy, and execution. The Red Army had demonstrated that it could launch and sustain a massive offensive, striking at the very heart of German power in the East. The tightening of the pincer was not just a battlefield maneuver, it was the opening chapter of the destruction of the Sixth Army and the reversal of Germany's fortunes in the war. On the morning of November 23, 1942, the icy steppe west of Stalingrad became the stage for one of the most decisive moments in the entire Second World War. Soviet armored spearheads, racing from the north and south, converged at the small town of Kalag on the Don River. The thunder of tank engines echoed across the frozen plain as Soviet units sighted one another from opposite directions. At 10 a.m., the lead elements of the 4th Tank Corps linked up with the 26th Tank Corps, their commanders shaking hands amidst the smoke and snow. It was a symbolic gesture, yet it represented the culmination of months of careful planning by Zhukov, Vasilevsky, and the Stavka High Command. The ring around Stalingrad was now closed, and with it nearly 300,000 Axis soldiers were trapped inside. The once proud German Sixth Army, reinforced by remnants of Romanian, Italian, and Croatian units, was sealed in a pocket stretching from the Volga to the Don. For the first time in the war, an entire German field army was encircled on such a massive scale. The Soviet trap had snapped shut with precision, and the jaws of Operation Uranus were now locked. The German soldiers inside the cauldron at Stalingrad were initially unaware of the scale of the disaster. Many continued their brutal street battles amid the ruins of factories and apartment blocks, convinced that the fighting outside the city was only temporary. Rumors of Soviet breakthroughs filtered in with wounded men and retreating supply columns, but official reassurances from Paulus's headquarters downplayed the severity. Even when units reported Soviet tanks cutting roads behind them, officers insisted these were local disturbances that would soon be contained. In reality, the Sixth Army was already cut off from all land routes, its rear areas overrun, its supplies interrupted. The pocket stretched nearly 50 kilometers wide and 70 kilometers deep, with over 250,000 Axis troops penned in like cattle. The full magnitude of their entrapment would take days to sink in, but already the walls were closing in. What seemed like a temporary setback would soon reveal itself as a catastrophe without precedent. The ring of steel was no longer theoretical, it was real, solid, and unbreakable. The capture of Calar was more than a symbolic victory. It was the logistical and strategic key to sealing the encirclement. The bridges over the Don at Calar had long served as the vital artery for German supplies, reinforcements, and retreats. Once secured by Soviet engineers and tanks, no relief column could reach Paulus's army by road. German convoys attempting to cross were either destroyed in place or forced to turn back, abandoning vehicles and supplies. Soviet artillery quickly repositioned to cover the approaches, pounding any attempt at counterattack. Prisoners captured near Calar reported scenes of chaos, horses abandoned, wagons burned, and soldiers fleeing on foot in the snow. Soviet propaganda leaflets declared the cauldron closed, urging German soldiers to surrender before annihilation. While many dismissed such claims as lies, their reality was undeniable. The encirclement was complete. Calar had become the lock on the Soviet trap, and Paulus's army was now a prisoner of its own commander's stubborn orders. The scale of the encirclement was staggering, and the Soviets wasted no time in strengthening their grip. Orders were issued to establish 2 concentric rings, an inner cordon to contain the trapped Germans, and an outer ring to protect against any relief attempt. The inner ring bristled with artillery, machine gun nests, and anti-tank positions designed to crush breakout attempts. The outer ring stretched across hundreds of kilometers, manned by fresh Soviet divisions and fortified to resist German counterblows from outside. In effect, the trapped Sixth Army was encased in a double wall of steel and fire. Soviet supply lines worked tirelessly to keep their armies fed and fueled, even as temperatures plunged below freezing. Meanwhile, reconnaissance aircraft circled above, monitoring German movements within the pocket. Every road, every crossroads, and every possible escape corridor was mapped and covered. Stalin and the Stavka had learned from past failures. This time, no enemy would be allowed to break free. The mood inside the German command posts shifted from denial to grim recognition as the reports piled in. Paulus, sitting in his Stalingrad headquarters, received maps showing Soviet positions closing in on all sides. His staff officers urged him to attempt an immediate breakout before the Soviets could consolidate their grip, but Paulus hesitated. Hitler's orders, arriving from the Wolf's Lair, were unequivocal. The Sixth Army was to stand fast, hold Stalingrad, and await relief. This command condemned the trapped soldiers to isolation, transforming their situation from precarious to hopeless. The Luftwaffe, already stretched thin, was promised as the lifeline that would keep the Sixth Army supplied by air. Paulus, loyal and cautious, deferred to Hitler's authority despite his doubts. Instead of retreating while there was still time, the German army dug in and prepared to endure. The decision would go down as one of the most disastrous in military history. Among the soldiers, the reality of encirclement spread like wildfire, carried by rumors, broken communications, and the sight of Soviet columns on every horizon. Infantrymen, who once believed in the invincibility of the Wehrmacht, now realized they were cut off, stranded in the ruins of a city that had become their prison. Supply lines collapsed almost overnight, leaving troops without food, fuel, or winter clothing. Horses, once used for transport, were slaughtered for meat as rations dwindled. German medics reported growing numbers of frostbite cases, while ammunition shortages forced soldiers to conserve every bullet. Axis allies, Romanians, Italians, and Hungarians, suffered even worse, often abandoned by their German counterparts to fend for themselves. Prisoners captured by the Soviets described despair spreading through the ranks, though discipline and fear of reprisals kept most from open mutiny. Letters to families at home spoke of difficulties but never the truth of entrapment. For tens of thousands of soldiers, November 23rd marked the beginning of a slow descent into hunger, cold, and hopelessness. On the Soviet side, the atmosphere was one of jubilation mixed with determination. For the first time since the beginning of the war, the Red Army had achieved not just a defensive victory, but a massive encirclement of enemy forces. Commanders reported the success to Moscow, where Stalin and the Stavka greeted the news with both satisfaction and caution. Stalin insisted that no celebration occur until the Sixth Army was completely destroyed, reminding his generals that Germany would surely attempt to rescue. Soviet soldiers, however, celebrated in their own way, sharing vodka, singing songs, and writing home about the historic victory they had taken part in. The propaganda machine shifted into full gear, proclaiming that the Red Army had trapped Hitler's mightiest force. Newspapers called Stalingrad the grave of the German invader. The soldiers manning the outer ring understood their responsibility. They were the wall keeping salvation away from the trapped enemy. The Soviets had won a great victory, but the battle was far from over. The encirclement of November 23rd was the climax of Operation Uranus, a moment when the entire balance of the Eastern Front shifted. For over a year, the Germans had seemed unstoppable, advancing across thousands of kilometers of Soviet soil. Now, with one brilliant stroke, the Red Army had turned the tables, capturing not just territory, but an entire German army group. Nearly 300,000 Axis soldiers were trapped in what the Soviets called the cauldron, and their fate would become one of the most dramatic episodes of the war. The world watched in astonishment as the news spread. Berlin dismissed it as temporary, while London and Washington hailed it as proof that Hitler could be beaten. In Stalingrad, the trapped soldiers prepared for a long ordeal, unaware that their ordeal would end in destruction. The steel ring around the city was impenetrable, forged in fire and blood by the Red Army's greatest triumph. Operation Uranus had succeeded, and the fate of the Sixth Army was sealed. The encirclement of the Sixth Army at Stalingrad struck the German high command like a thunderbolt, shattering the illusion of control that Hitler had cultivated. In his East Prussian headquarters at the Wolf's Lair, reports arrived slowly, fragmented, and often minimized by subordinates, fearful of his rage. The first communiques spoke of temporary setbacks, of Soviet breakthroughs on the flanks, but the scale of the disaster soon became undeniable. Entire Romanian armies had been routed, Italian divisions shattered, and supply lines across the Don obliterated. The Soviet trap, once dismissed as impossible, was now a reality, and Paulus's Sixth Army was sealed inside Stalingrad with no escape. Hitler's initial response was disbelief, refusing to accept that his once invincible Wehrmacht could be cornered. He shouted at his generals, accusing them of exaggeration and defeatism, and demanded immediate countermeasures. The Führer's refusal to face reality delayed critical decisions, turning a crisis into catastrophe. For the men trapped in Stalingrad, every hour lost to Hitler's denial would cost thousands of lives. The shock had set in, but acceptance would come only slowly, dragged out by stubborn pride and delusion. Generals on the ground, and in the rear, understood the severity of the situation far better than Hitler. Field Marshal von Manstein, a master strategist brought back into service to stabilize the collapsing southern front, warned Berlin that the situation required urgent action. His assessment was blunt. The Sixth Army could not hold out indefinitely and must attempt an immediate breakout while it still had fuel, ammunition, and fighting strength. General Zeitzler, Halder's successor as Chief of the General Staff, also pressed for decisive movement. Yet each time these warnings reached Hitler, they were brushed aside as cowardice or defeatism. The Führer's obsession with holding Stalingrad for its symbolic value blinded him to the strategic necessity of retreat. To Hitler, Stalingrad had become not just a city, but a monument to his prestige, and abandoning it was unthinkable. In his mind, the Sixth Army was to form an immovable fortress, holding out until relief came. That relief, however, existed only in fantasy. The gap between reality at the front and delusion at headquarters widened with every passing day. Hitler's disbelief manifested in the form of reckless promises, the most notorious being the reliance on the Luftwaffe to supply the trapped army. Hermann Göring, eager to maintain favor with Hitler, boasted that his air fleet could deliver 500 tons of supplies daily to Stalingrad. In truth, such numbers were impossible, as German airfields were too far, aircraft too few, and Soviet fighters and flak too deadly. Logistics officers tried to explain that the maximum realistic capacity was less than a third of what was required. Hitler, however, seized on Göring's promise, treating it as gospel and refusing to authorize Paulus to break out. For the soldiers freezing in Stalingrad, this decision meant starvation, as food and fuel dwindled at a terrifying pace. The promise of an air bridge became a cruel mirage, buying Hitler time while dooming the Sixth Army. Generals privately despaired, realizing the trap was closing permanently. The Luftwaffe's failure was inevitable, but Hitler's faith in Göring's boast sealed the fate of 300,000 men. The shock of encirclement had given way to fantasy-driven decisions that made salvation impossible. Within the Führer's headquarters, the atmosphere turned toxic as the magnitude of the disaster became clearer. Officers whispered their doubts in corridors, but in Hitler's presence, few dared to challenge him openly. Zeitzler, more courageous than most, slammed his hand on the map table, demanding that Hitler face the truth. He argued that Paulus must be allowed to attempt to break out immediately, before winter deepened and Soviet defenses hardened. Hitler's response was fury. He accused his generals of lacking faith, and compared them unfavorably to soldiers fighting in the ruins of Stalingrad. He insisted that the Sixth Army had the moral obligation to stand firm, turning the disaster into a matter of ideology rather than strategy. This atmosphere of fear stifled open debate, leaving critical voices unheard. The High Command became an echo chamber, reinforcing Hitler's illusions rather than confronting them. Every day spent in denial drained the Sixth Army's strength, and still the order to break out never came. Shock had paralyzed not just Hitler, but the entire machinery of German command. Paulus himself was caught between the desperation of his army and the absolute authority of Hitler. As reports streamed in of Soviet tanks tightening the noose, Paulus convened his staff to discuss options. His generals urged a breakout, pointing to the dwindling supplies and the worsening weather. Yet Paulus, a meticulous and cautious officer, lacked the daring to defy Hitler's orders outright. He was no gambler like Guderian or Rommel. He was a loyal servant of the chain of command. When Hitler's message arrived, Sixth Army will stand fast at Stalingrad, Paulus obeyed without protest. His passivity condemned his army to immobility, even as Soviet divisions consolidated the encirclement. Historians would later debate whether Paulus had the authority or courage to disobey, but in November 1942 his compliance sealed his fate. The German High Command's paralysis had flowed downward, infecting the frontline commanders themselves. Stalingrad became a trap not just of steel, but of obedience and misplaced loyalty. Meanwhile, Manstein's warnings grew ever more urgent as he prepared to take command of Army Group Don, tasked with relieving the trapped Sixth Army. He stressed that Paulus must attempt to break out toward the southwest, to meet his relief forces halfway. Without such coordination, any rescue attempt would be doomed, as his forces were too weak to fight through the Soviet ring alone. Manstein's pleas to Hitler emphasized speed, mobility, and initiative. But Hitler clung stubbornly to his vision of holding Stalingrad as a fortress until relief arrived from outside. The logic was circular and fatally flawed. Paulus could not break out because relief was coming, and relief could not succeed because Paulus remained trapped. This contradiction condemned both strategies to failure. Manstein understood the truth, but lacked the power to override Hitler. His frustration grew as he watched the window of opportunity shrink with every passing day. The shock at headquarters was giving way to stubborn defiance, and with it, disaster. In Berlin, the propaganda machine worked feverishly to conceal the scale of the crisis from the German public. Newspapers spoke of difficult days at the front, but assured readers that the Sixth Army was firmly in control of Stalingrad. Radio broadcasts extolled the heroism of Paulus's men, presenting them as defenders of European civilization against Bolshevism. Behind the curtain, however, officials in the Ministry of Propaganda panicked at the thought of a humiliating defeat. Joseph Goebbels himself urged Hitler to prepare the population for the possibility of setbacks, but Hitler refused. He believed that admitting weakness would embolden enemies at home and abroad. Thus, the reality of encirclement was hidden from the public, replaced with images of valor and determination. The soldiers at Stalingrad became martyrs in waiting, though their families knew nothing of the disaster unfolding. This disconnect between propaganda and reality reflected the larger denial within the German High Command. The shock was not just military, but political, a crisis of both strategy and truth. By late November, the full weight of the encirclement could no longer be denied. Even within Hitler's inner circle, maps in the Wolf's Lair showed a massive Soviet ring encasing the Sixth Army, with no viable corridors open for escape. Still, Hitler clung to the belief that relief was possible, promising new offensives and reinforcements that did not exist. The generals, increasingly demoralized, watched as one of the strongest formations in the Wehrmacht was slowly strangled. The refusal to allow Paulus to break out marked a turning point in the war, transforming a grave setback into a strategic catastrophe. The shock of Stalingrad reverberated not only across the Eastern Front, but also in Berlin, where confidence in Hitler's infallibility began to erode. What began as disbelief hardened into defiance of reality, a refusal to accept the limits of German power. The consequences of this denial would echo far beyond Stalingrad, shaping the rest of the war. In that frozen November, the German High Command stood paralyzed by shock, blinded by ideology, and chained to the will of one man, and for the Sixth Army there would be no escape. When the Soviet pincers closed on November 23, 1942, the German Sixth Army suddenly found itself trapped inside what soldiers grimly called the Kessel, the cauldron. Within days, 300,000 Axis troops, including Germans, Romanians, and auxiliary units, were packed into the frozen ruins of Stalingrad and the barren steppe beyond. The encirclement severed all supply lines, leaving the army wholly dependent on Goering's promised airlift that never came close to delivering enough. The warehouses that had once brimmed with ammunition and rations emptied quickly, and the first signs of hunger set in. Soldiers searched abandoned buildings, scavenged horse carcasses, and boiled leather belts to extract a few calories. The vast open steppe, once seen as space for maneuver, now became a prison, hemmed in by Soviet divisions tightening the ring. Bitter winds swept through trenches and bomb craters, chilling men to the bone. Equipment froze, rifles jammed, and frostbite spread as cruelly as Soviet artillery. The dream of victory on the Volga had collapsed into the nightmare of survival. For the men of the Sixth Army, the Kessel became a slow death sentence. Starvation became the most relentless enemy inside the Kessel. Daily rations shrank from 300 grams of bread to barely a crust, often mixed with sawdust to make it last longer. Meat vanished quickly, forcing soldiers to slaughter their own pack animals, then strip the carcasses of every edible part. By December, they boiled horse heads for soup, scraping marrow from bones, while some whispered about cannibalism in the darkest corners of the ruins. Men grew gaunt, eyes hollow, faces skeletal, their once proud uniforms hanging loosely from emaciated bodies. Fatigue from hunger dulled their senses, making even simple tasks unbearable. Soldiers hoarded crumbs, fought over scraps, and risked death crawling toward suspected food caches. Cigarettes, once a comfort, became currency, traded desperately for a bite of bread. Hunger gnawed not only at stomachs, but also at morale, eroding the fighting spirit of the once elite formations. In the Kessel, starvation was as deadly as Soviet bullets. The cold was merciless, often plunging to -30 degrees Celsius at night, freezing exposed skin within minutes. Soldiers wrapped themselves in rags, newspapers, and anything they could scavenge to ward off the biting wind. Wool uniforms were inadequate, and most had long since lost proper winter clothing during the summer advance. Frostbite spread quickly, blackening toes, fingers, and faces until amputation was the only option. Medical staff, already overwhelmed, lacked supplies to treat the wounded, forcing them to triage with brutal efficiency. Men huddled together in ruins and dugouts, lighting small fires that choked them with smoke, but offered a few degrees of warmth. Helmets were used as cooking pots, boots dried by embers, yet nothing seemed to stop the creeping chill. Dead soldiers, frozen stiff, often lay beside the living because the ground was too hard to dig graves. The steppe became a wasteland, littered with white-shrouded corpses, mute testimony to the army's suffering. The cold, like hunger, spared no one, officer or private, veteran or recruit. Disease followed hunger and cold, spreading rapidly in the overcrowded ruins. Lice infested clothing and blankets, spreading typhus and dysentery among exhausted men. Medical supplies, once plentiful, dwindled to nothing, leaving surgeons to operate without anesthetics and dress wounds with paper or rags. Water sources were scarce, often contaminated, forcing soldiers to melt snow or drink from shell holes mixed with blood and fuel. Diarrhea and dysentery weakened men already starving, leaving them too weak to stand guard or fight. In makeshift hospitals, rows of wounded groaned in unheated rooms, where temperatures froze morphine and shattered glass. Doctors and nurses performed miracles with what little they had, but most could do nothing but watch patients wither. The stench of decay filled the air as gangrene claimed limbs, untreated wounds festered, and fever consumed entire battalions. The Kessel was not just a battlefield but a breeding ground for epidemics. Disease stripped the Sixth Army of strength faster than Soviet artillery. For many, death by illness came long before a Soviet bullet. Psychological strain bore down on the trapped soldiers, breaking minds as surely as bodies. At first men clung to hope that relief would come, repeating rumors of Manstein's counteroffensive. But as weeks dragged into months, optimism gave way to despair, and the once disciplined formations dissolved into survivalist cliques. Some soldiers scribbled last letters home, knowing they might never be delivered, pouring out confessions, regrets, and farewells. Others turned to fatalism, speaking of destiny and resignation to die in Stalingrad's ruins. Alcohol, when found, became both poison and salvation, numbing fear if only for a night. Officers struggled to maintain order, but desertion, suicide, and mental collapse became increasingly common. Faith in Hitler crumbled as his promises of salvation proved hollow, though many still feared speaking openly. The constant shelling, the howl of the wind, and the sight of friends dying daily etched trauma into every survivor's mind. In the Kessel, the greatest battle was often fought not against the Soviets but against despair. The airlift, meant to sustain the army, turned into a cruel farce. Each day, German troops scanned the skies for transport planes, hoping they carried food, fuel, or ammunition. Instead, they brought pitiful loads, often carrying mail, propaganda leaflets, or luxury items for officers. Pilots risked death from Soviet flak and fighters, yet their cargo rarely matched the army's desperate needs. An army that required 700 tons of supplies daily often received fewer than 100, leaving units to starve and guns to fall silent. Wounded men crowded airfields, begging to be flown out, but only a fraction were evacuated. Planes returned with tales of chaos on the ground, of men clinging to landing gear in desperation. The failure of the Luftwaffe shattered what little hope remained, as men realized no rescue was coming. Each empty stomach and failed resupply deepened the sense of betrayal. The air bridge became a symbol of false promises, leaving the army to waste away in its icy grave. Inside the Kessel, discipline began to unravel under the weight of despair. Some officers still enforced harsh order, executing deserters and looters to maintain control. Yet in many units, hierarchy collapsed, and survival became the only law. Soldiers stripped the dead of boots, coats, and weapons, caring little for rank or comradeship. Looting spread through abandoned warehouses and civilian homes, though little of value remained. Civilians trapped in the ruins suffered alongside soldiers, caught in the same starvation and cold, often ignored or exploited. Hunger eroded morality, transforming proud divisions into ragged mobs clinging to life. Yet even in this hell, acts of kindness persisted. Soldiers sharing crusts of bread, medics working tirelessly despite futility, chaplains praying over the dying. The Kessel became a crucible where humanity and savagery coexisted in brutal measure. Stalingrad was no longer a battle, it was a test of the soul. As December bled into January, the encircled army realized that their fate was sealed. Relief from Manstein's forces stalled, the Soviets tightened their grip, and Hitler's promises grew emptier by the day. The men of the Sixth Army became shadows of themselves, starved, frozen, and broken. Letters recovered after the war reveal the despair of soldiers who no longer believed in survival, writing farewells with trembling hands. Entire companies shrank to handfuls of survivors, too weak to fight, too cold to march, too hungry to resist. The Kessel became a graveyard, where silence often replaced gunfire, as death claimed more men than combat. By mid-January, surrender seemed inevitable, but Hitler still demanded that Stalingrad be held to the last bullet. Inside the ring, soldiers whispered bitterly that they had been abandoned, sacrificed for the pride of one man. The Kessel was no fortress. It was a tomb, and as the Soviets prepared their final assault, the Sixth Army's suffering reached its terrible climax. When the jaws of the Soviet encirclement snapped shut at Kalek, Hermann Goering stepped forward with a bold, reckless assurance. To Hitler, stunned by the sudden disaster, Goering pledged that the Luftwaffe could sustain the Sixth Army entirely by air. He pointed to earlier successes, such as the Damiansk Pocket in 1942, where German troops had survived months of encirclement supplied solely from the sky. Yet Damiansk had involved far fewer men, shorter distances, and a much smaller daily requirement of tonnage. At Stalingrad, the Sixth Army needed at least 700 tons of food, ammunition, and fuel each day just to function at minimal combat strength. Goering promised this figure could be met, despite his generals and logisticians warning otherwise. Hitler, desperate for reassurance, clung to Goering's boast and ordered the army to stand fast, forbidding any breakout. In that single decision, tens of thousands of men were condemned to slow death inside the Kessel. The Luftwaffe's air bridge was destined to become a cruel illusion, collapsing under the weight of impossible demands. The logistical challenge was staggering from the outset. The only viable airfields within reach of the pocket, Potomnik, Gumrak, and a few smaller strips, were themselves primitive and vulnerable to Soviet attack. Transport aircraft had to fly hundreds of kilometers from bases in the rear, braving anti-aircraft fire, Soviet fighters, and unpredictable weather. Winter brought heavy snowstorms, freezing fog, and fierce crosswinds that made landings treacherous. Each Junkers Ju-52 transport, the Luftwaffe's workhorse, could carry barely 2.5 tons of supplies in ideal conditions. Even with hundreds of flights daily, the required 700 tons was beyond reach. More advanced aircraft like the Heinkel He 111 bombers were pressed into transport duty, yet their limited capacity further underlined the futility. Mechanics struggled to keep aircraft serviceable as cold crippled engines and froze hydraulic systems. Crews flew until exhaustion, often making multiple trips per day with little rest. The sheer mathematics of the airlift revealed its impossibility long before the first plane touched down. As the operation began, the gap between promises and reality became painfully evident. On some days, barely 80 tons of supplies reached the Sixth Army, less than a tenth of the minimum required. Ammunition shipments were prioritized, but this meant soldiers received only crumbs of bread and watered-down soup. Desperate infantrymen cursed the Luftwaffe for delivering bullets instead of food, yet commanders argued that without ammunition the front would collapse entirely. Even when supplies did arrive, distribution was chaotic, as units fought each other for meager allotments. Frozen fuel drums were useless, and often aircraft carried irrelevant goods such as officers' luxury items or propaganda leaflets. Soldiers joked bitterly that Goering's airlift delivered promises instead of bread. Meanwhile, Soviet artillery relentlessly shelled the airfields, turning every landing into a gamble with death. The reality of the airlift was far from Goering's boast. It was starvation delivered by air. For the men in the Kessel, the skies brought not salvation, but false hope. The pilots of the Luftwaffe endured unimaginable conditions in their attempt to sustain the doomed army. Many flew outdated and worn-out aircraft, their engines coughing in the freezing air, and their fuselages patched with sheet metal. Takeoffs were made on icy runways where skids replaced wheels, and landings often ended in crashes that killed crew and ground personnel alike. Soviet fighters, particularly Yakovlev and Lag interceptors, patrolled the skies aggressively, cutting down slow-moving transports in flames. Anti-aircraft fire stitched the horizon, forcing crews to fly low, where ice formed rapidly on wings and windshields. Crews often lacked adequate winter clothing, flying in unheated cabins that froze their breath into ice crystals on instruments. Some flights ended with aircraft landing on improvised fields, where ground crews used horses to tow them from snowdrifts. For pilots, each mission was not only a duty, but a death lottery. Their sacrifice was immense, but the results could never match the desperate needs below. The Luftwaffe itself was being bled white in the skies above Stalingrad. As weeks passed, Potomnik airfield became the lifeline of the pocket, but it also became its greatest vulnerability. Constantly under Soviet artillery bombardment, the runways were cratered daily and patched at night, often with wooden planks and frozen earth. Dead and wounded soldiers crowded the perimeter, hoping for evacuation, yet only a fraction were ever flown out. Planes landed amid chaos, with ground crews loading supplies under fire and rushing wounded aboard in minutes. Soldiers begged pilots to take them, clinging to wings and landing gear, only to be kicked off as engines roared. The airfield was littered with wreckage of burned-out transports, their charred skeletons testimony to the dangers of each mission. Soviet artillery targeted takeoffs mercilessly, often destroying planes moments after they left the ground. As Potomnik fell in mid-January, Gumrak became the next hub, but it was even smaller and less capable. With each loss, the lifeline grew thinner. The Luftwaffe's artery to Stalingrad was being severed piece by piece. By January 1943, the scale of failure was undeniable. Instead of 700 tons daily, the average delivered was barely 100, sometimes as low as 50. Fuel shortages crippled mobility, forcing tanks and vehicles to be abandoned in snowdrifts. Artillery fell silent as ammunition ran out, leaving German troops powerless against Soviet bombardment. Hunger gnawed mercilessly, with soldiers eating horse meat, soup from boiled leather, and bread mixed with sawdust. Morale collapsed as men realized the airlift was not their salvation, but their slow execution. Letters captured by the Soviets revealed desperate appeals for bread, fuel, and relief that never came. Pilots themselves admitted that they were flying missions doomed to futility, sacrificing lives for cargoes that changed nothing. Goering's arrogance had condemned not only the army, but also thousands of Luftwaffe airmen. The airlift had failed not because of lack of courage, but because of its very impossibility. For the men trapped inside the Kessel, the skies above brought despair, not deliverance. Goering, meanwhile, remained insulated from the reality he had created. He continued to boast of his Luftwaffe's prowess, dismissing reports of failure and blaming subordinates for shortfalls. Hitler clung to his assurances, unwilling to admit that his decision to hold Stalingrad had become a death sentence. In Berlin, propaganda still spoke of the heroism of the airlift, presenting it as proof of German strength and loyalty. In truth, the Luftwaffe was hemorrhaging aircraft and crews it could ill afford to lose. Transport planes destroyed at Stalingrad could never be replaced, weakening the Luftwaffe's ability to fight on other fronts. Pilots wrote bitterly in diaries of being sacrificed for Goering's vanity, risking everything for missions they knew could not succeed. Meanwhile, the men in the Kessel read those propaganda leaflets with bitter irony, their bellies empty and their comrades dying. The disconnect between the high command and the front had never been more glaring. Goering's promise had become the army's curse. The Luftwaffe's failed airlift stands today as one of the most tragic illusions of the Second World War. It combined technical bravado with strategic blindness, asking too much of an air force already stretched to breaking point. The sacrifice of pilots and crews was immense, yet it could never match the needs of an encircled army of 300,000 men. Each flight risked annihilation. Each landing was an act of courage, but the arithmetic of tonnage made their mission impossible from the start. The Sixth Army slowly starved, its fate sealed not by lack of bravery, but by false promises. When the last airfield at Gumrak fell in January, the pocket was cut off completely, left to die in silence. The airlift heralded as salvation had in reality prolonged the agony by weeks, delaying the inevitable collapse. For the men on the ground, it symbolized betrayal, a hope dangled before them only to vanish in smoke and fire. The story of Stalingrad cannot be told without the bitter memory of the airlift's failure. It was the moment when the skies above, once seen as protection, became the cruelest reminder of hopelessness. As the Sixth Army starved within the icy grip of the Stalingrad pocket, a flicker of hope emerged from the south under the name Operation Wintergewitter, or Winter Storm. The architect of this desperate gamble was Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, newly appointed commander of Army Group Don, tasked with salvaging the catastrophe. Manstein was a master strategist, admired even by his adversaries, and he believed that a bold relief attempt could yet alter the course of the campaign. His plan was to strike northward from the Kotelnikovo area with the 4th Panzer Army, spearheaded by General Hoth's experienced armored divisions. These forces, though weary and battered, still possessed enough tanks and mechanized units to punch through Soviet lines if concentrated effectively. The objective was clear: advance along the frozen steppe, break through Soviet defenses, and open a corridor to the Sixth Army. The clock was merciless, for Paulus's men were already collapsing under hunger, disease, and unrelenting Soviet pressure. Every day lost meant thousands more dead within the Kessel. With Hitler refusing to authorize a breakout, Winter Storm became the only lifeline left. The fate of an entire army now hung on a desperate gamble in the snowbound wastes of southern Russia. On December 12, 1942, the operation was launched, with German panzers rolling forward under the low winter sun. The 4th Panzer Army fielded nearly 250 operational tanks, including formidable Panzer IVs and the newly introduced Tigers, weapons meant to smash Soviet formations. Supporting infantry divisions trailed behind, while artillery batteries roared into life, clearing the way for the armored spearheads. Initial progress was promising, as the German assault tore into the Soviet 51st Army, which had not expected a counteroffensive of such scale. The Red Army's lines wavered, with units falling back under the hammer blows of concentrated armor. Villages along the approach route were seized in bitter firefights, their snow-covered ruins littered with bodies and wrecked vehicles. German commanders reported optimism, believing that the path to Stalingrad might actually be forced open. Communications crackled with news of advances measured in kilometers rather than meters, a rare occurrence in the harsh Russian winter. For the first time since the encirclement, Paulus's soldiers listened to their radios with renewed hope. The relief seemed tangible, as though salvation was grinding northward on steel treads. Yet beneath this surge of momentum lay a precarious foundation. The divisions Manstein commanded were not fresh. They were exhausted from months of combat and weakened by stretched supply lines. Fuel shortages plagued the panzers, forcing careful rationing that slowed the pace of advance. The infantry lacked adequate winter clothing, shivering in the open steppe as temperatures plunged to -20 degrees Celsius. Soviet resistance stiffened quickly as reinforcements from the 2nd Guards Army began to arrive, directed by the sharp mind of Marshal Zhukov. Unlike the ill-equipped Axis allies along the Don, these were seasoned Soviet troops with solid morale and plentiful reserves. German commanders sensed the window of opportunity narrowing with each passing hour as the Red Army's strength gathered like a storm on the horizon. Still, the panzers pressed forward, trading speed for caution, their engines groaning as they crawled across icy ground. Each kilometer gained required ferocious fighting, often against entrenched Soviet anti-tank positions. For every village seized, another ambush awaited just ahead. Winter Storm was racing against time, and time was siding with the Soviets. Inside the Stalingrad pocket, Paulus and his staff followed the news of the relief attempt with anxious anticipation. Reports filtered in that German forces were advancing from Kotelnikovo, and soldiers whispered of imminent rescue. Starving troops clung to this hope like a lifeline, watching the frozen skies for a sign of friendly aircraft carrying messages of progress. Yet the 6th Army remained chained by Hitler's orders to hold its ground, forbidden to attempt a breakout toward the relief column. Paulus himself, though a competent officer, lacked the audacity to defy Hitler and initiate movement without explicit authorization. Instead, he awaited instructions that never came, as his army deteriorated hour by hour. The paradox grew unbearable. Salvation inched closer from the south, but the trapped divisions made no move to meet it. Without a coordinated breakout, the relief operation would need to fight its way into the pocket, a far more difficult and costly endeavor. For soldiers on both sides of the encirclement, the tension was agonizing. The question was no longer whether relief was possible, but whether it would come too late. As December wore on, the Soviet High Command recognized the danger of Manstein's thrust and moved decisively to counter it. Marshal Zhukov and General Vasilevsky redeployed fresh Soviet armies, including the Second Guards, into blocking positions along the German axis of advance. Fierce battles erupted near Verkhono-Kumsky, where German panzers clashed head-on with Soviet armor in swirling melees across the snowbound steppe. Each engagement drained German strength, as tanks broke down or were destroyed by Soviet anti-tank guns. The Red Army employed deep defensive belts, forcing the Germans to grind through layer after layer of resistance. Soviet artillery, concealed in tree lines and ridges, pounded advancing units, turning the open plains into killing grounds. Air support, once a German strength, was neutralized by poor weather and Soviet fighters that harried Luftwaffe bombers. Slowly, the momentum that had carried Winter Storm forward began to falter. Manstein knew his spearheads were bleeding strength too quickly. The corridor to Stalingrad, still over 50 kilometers away, was beginning to fade from reach. The climax came as German forces reached the Maskirovka River, the last major barrier before Stalingrad itself. Here the Soviets had massed their defenses, anchoring their lines with artillery, minefields, and resilient infantry divisions. The German panzers, already depleted, launched desperate assaults across frozen riverbanks under withering fire. Some units briefly established bridgeheads, but they were quickly thrown back by Soviet counterattacks. Casualties mounted alarmingly, and fuel shortages meant that many tanks simply ground to a halt, abandoned by their crews. The Sixth Army, listening in despair from the pocket, was tantalizingly close yet impossibly far. Paulus pleaded with Hitler for permission to attempt a breakout to link with Manstein's spearheads, but the answer was once again a firm refusal. Hitler insisted that the Sixth Army hold Stalingrad, clinging to his vision of the city as a symbol of German resolve. The chance to break the encirclement slipped away as Soviet reinforcements flooded the battlefield. Winter Storm had reached its zenith, only to collapse against Soviet steel and ice. By December 23rd, Manstein realized the futility of continuing the offensive. His forces were exhausted, their tank strength reduced to a fraction of the initial assault, and supply shortages left units immobile in the snow. The Soviets now counterattacked with increasing ferocity, forcing the Germans into defensive positions just to hold what little ground they had gained. To press further would risk the annihilation of Hoth's 4th Panzer Army, leaving the southern front in ruins. Reluctantly, Manstein ordered a withdrawal, his relief operation having failed to reach its goal. For the Sixth Army, the last flicker of salvation was extinguished. The pocket was now doomed to die where it stood, abandoned by strategy and betrayed by Hitler's obstinacy. Manstein would later argue that, had Paulus been allowed to break out, the two forces might have linked and saved much of the Sixth Army. Historians still debate this possibility, but the fact remains without freedom to maneuver, Winter Storm was bound to fail. Stalingrad's fate was sealed in the snow of the Maskirovka. Operation Wintergewitter stands as both a testament to German operational skill and a monument to the futility of hubris. Manstein's tactical brilliance had carved a path through formidable Soviet defenses, but strategic reality outweighed local successes. The Sixth Army's immobility, dictated by Hitler's refusal to authorize retreat, turned a daring relief attempt into a tragic gesture. For the soldiers within Stalingrad, the echoes of the battle to the south were the sounds of hope fading into despair. The Red Army meanwhile emerged stronger, proving that it could not only encircle, but also repel German counteroffensives. The failure of Winter Storm cemented the inevitability of the Sixth Army's destruction and the turning of the tide on the Eastern Front. Hitler's insistence on holding Stalingrad at all costs had transformed victory into catastrophe. The snow-covered field south of the city became the graveyard of Germany's last chance to save Paulus's men. Winter Storm was over, and with it ended the final hope of escape. From this point onward, the Sixth Army was trapped in a cage of ice and fire, awaiting its bitter end. Even as Manstein's relief attempt drove toward Stalingrad in Operation Winter Storm, the Soviet High Command was preparing a far broader strike, designed to shatter not only the German grip on the city, but the entire southern wing of the Axis front. This new offensive was codenamed Operation Little Saturn, a scaled-down version of an earlier plan for a massive encirclement, but still ambitious in scope and devastating in potential. Its target was not the Sixth Army trapped in Stalingrad, but the weaker Italian Eighth Army holding the line along the middle Don River. The Soviet leadership, led by Stalin, Zhukov, and Vasilevsky, recognized that these Axis allies lacked the armor, training, and morale to withstand a full-scale assault. By destroying them, the Soviets could widen the encirclement, cut off Manstein's relief forces, and slam the door on any hope of rescuing Paulus. Unlike the Germans, the Red Army had learned to think on a grand operational scale, integrating multiple fronts with precision timing. Troops were redeployed swiftly from other sectors, masked by deception and camouflage, in preparation for the blow. Soviet commanders knew that victory at Stalingrad required not only holding the Sixth Army in the pocket, but also eliminating any possibility of outside relief. With Winter Storm underway, Little Saturn was timed to strike like a hammer against Germany's exposed flank. The Italian Eighth Army was stretched thin over more than 200 kilometers of front, poorly armed and ill-prepared for the brutal Russian winter. Many Italian soldiers still wore inadequate uniforms, their coats designed for Mediterranean climates rather than steppe blizzards. Their artillery was largely antiquated, with too few anti-tank weapons capable of halting the massed Soviet armor gathering opposite them. Morale was low, for they had already witnessed the collapse of their Romanian and Hungarian comrades under earlier Soviet offensives. While some units fought bravely, most were conscripts with limited training, commanded by officers unfamiliar with the scale of mechanized warfare being waged on the Eastern Front. German commanders attached to the Italians repeatedly warned that the line was untenable, but Hitler dismissed these concerns, believing that Allied troops could hold firm while German formations concentrated elsewhere. The Soviets, meanwhile, were massing their most formidable forces, including the 1st Guards Army and the 6th Guards Army, along the Don sector. These troops were heavily equipped with T-34 tanks, Katyusha rocket batteries, and fresh artillery divisions. The imbalance was staggering, and the Italians were unknowingly sitting at ground zero of the Soviet counterstroke. On December 16, 1942, the offensive began with a thunderous artillery barrage that split the frozen silence of the Don front. Hundreds of Soviet guns unleashed a storm of shells, turning Italian trenches into firestorms of splintered wood, ice, and shattered bodies. Then came the tanks, surging forward in great steel waves, their tracks grinding through snowdrifts and their cannons firing relentlessly. Infantry poured in behind them, advancing with discipline and fury, overwhelming Italian strongpoints one after another. The Italians fought desperately in some places, manning their guns until Soviet armor simply rolled over their positions. In many sectors, however, panic spread quickly, and units broke into chaotic retreat under the relentless assault. Communications collapsed, commanders lost control, and the front disintegrated within hours. Entire battalions surrendered or fled, abandoning their weapons in the snow. Soviet spearheads carved through the line like knives, creating gaping holes that widened with every passing hour. Little Saturn had struck with devastating precision, and the Axis flank was collapsing into chaos. Within days, the Italian Eighth Army ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. Soviet tank columns exploited the breakthroughs, driving deep into the rear areas, seizing supply depots, and encircling pockets of resistance. German liaison officers attempted to organize defenses, but they lacked the manpower or armor to stop the Soviet juggernaut. The roads became scenes of tragedy, as retreating Italian columns were strafed by Soviet aircraft or overtaken by tanks, their soldiers scattering across the snowbound fields. Bitter winter conditions compounded the disaster, with frostbite and exposure claiming as many lives as bullets and shells. For many Italians, the retreat became a death march, remembered later as one of the darkest moments in Italy's military history. The Soviets pressed relentlessly, showing no mercy to their demoralized enemies, whose resistance crumbled in the face of overwhelming firepower. By the end of December, vast stretches of the Don Line had been swept clean, leaving only shattered remnants of once proud divisions. Entire divisions vanished from the order of battle, consumed in the inferno of the Soviet assault. The collapse was so total that it stunned even German commanders hardened by years of war. The consequences of Little Saturn went far beyond the destruction of Italy's contribution to the Eastern Front. By smashing through the Don sector, the Soviets threatened to encircle German forces still engaged in Operation Winter Storm. Hoth's 4th Panzer Army, already stalled near the Maskirovka River, suddenly faced the very real possibility of being cut off themselves. Manstein, forced to reassess his position, recognized that pressing toward Stalingrad was no longer viable. His spearheads were now vulnerable to being enveloped, and he had no choice but to withdraw southward to avoid disaster. What had begun as a daring attempt to rescue Paulus was now reduced to a desperate fight to save the relief force itself. The Soviet counterstroke not only sealed the fate of the Sixth Army, but also blunted the German effort to stabilize the southern front. The strategic initiative had shifted decisively, and the Red Army was now dictating the tempo of the campaign. For Hitler, this was an unthinkable humiliation, but for Stalin, it was proof that the Red Army had turned the tide of the war. Stalingrad was no longer a German opportunity, it was a German catastrophe. As Little Saturn unfolded, Soviet advances cut through rear area logistics hubs vital to the German war effort. Railway junctions, depots, and fuel dumps fell one after another, paralyzing Axis supply chains. German forces that had been earmarked to reinforce Stalingrad were instead diverted to stem the Soviet flood. Even veteran formations were hard-pressed, as Soviet Guards divisions pushed with relentless momentum, supported by swarms of T-34, S and Yak fighters. The Luftwaffe struggled to maintain control of the skies, but their overstretched squadrons were overwhelmed by both weather and numbers. Italian survivors retreated in small broken groups, often without weapons, trudging westward through snow and ice. The Soviets captured thousands, adding to the growing tide of Axis prisoners already filling their camps. Meanwhile, morale among Germany's other allies, Hungarians and Romanians, plummeted as they saw what awaited them if Soviet offensives targeted their sectors next. The Don Front, once the backbone of Hitler's Grand Summer campaign, had become a gaping wound bleeding Axis strength. Stalin's strategy of striking the weaker links had succeeded beyond all expectations. For the Sixth Army in Stalingrad, Little Saturn was the final nail in the coffin. Any realistic hope of relief vanished as the Soviet pincers closed tighter around the city, isolating Paulus completely. The starving, freezing soldiers inside the Kessel still clung to faint rumors of rescue, but as weeks dragged on, despair hardened into grim resignation. Supplies dwindled to nothing, with horses, leather, and even wallpaper paste being consumed in a desperate struggle against starvation. Disease spread through the ranks, claiming men faster than Soviet shells. Paulus's pleas for permission to surrender were ignored, while Hitler raged about betrayal and demanded that the city be held at all costs. Outside the pocket, Manstein could do nothing more than stabilize his retreating forces and prevent total collapse along the southern front. The Sixth Army, numbering hundreds of thousands just months earlier, was now reduced to a skeleton force awaiting inevitable destruction. The thunder of Soviet artillery from the Little Saturn offensive was the death knell echoing through the ruins of Stalingrad. The endgame had begun, and there would be no reprieve. Operation Little Saturn transformed the Eastern Front in ways that extended far beyond Stalingrad. The destruction of the Italian Eighth Army and the collapse of the Don Line exposed the deep weaknesses in Germany's coalition war effort. Hitler's reliance on poorly equipped allies to hold critical sectors had backfired disastrously, and his refusal to allow flexible withdrawals had compounded the catastrophe. For the Soviets, the offensive demonstrated their growing mastery of large-scale operational art, integrating deception, timing, and overwhelming force to achieve decisive results. The momentum generated by Little Saturn carried forward into 1943, setting the stage for further offensives that would drive the Germans back across the steppe. It also marked a psychological turning point, proving to both Axis and Allies that the Wehrmacht could be not only stopped but decisively beaten. Stalingrad was no longer a battle for a city. It had become the crucible in which Hitler's dream of victory in the East began to collapse. Little Saturn was the strike that widened the wound beyond repair. The fate of the Sixth Army was sealed, and with it the fate of Hitler's grand Eastern gamble. By January 1943, the Sixth Army was a shadow of the mighty force that had marched proudly into Stalingrad only months earlier. Encircled, starving, and ravaged by frostbite and disease, the soldiers huddled in cellars and ruins, waiting for an end they could no longer delay. Ammunition was nearly gone. Rations had dwindled to nothing, and even horses and scraps of leather had long since been consumed. The once disciplined army had fractured into clusters of gaunt men, shivering in their ragged uniforms, their weapons frozen, their will broken. Soviet artillery pounded the city relentlessly, collapsing walls, burying men alive, and reminding them each day that no rescue was coming. Rumors spread that Manstein would return, but the reality of Operation Little Saturn had already crushed that illusion. German radios inside the pocket transmitted desperate pleas to Berlin, but the responses were vague promises and hollow commands to hold firm. Hitler refused any suggestion of surrender, clinging to the fantasy that the Sixth Army could somehow resist indefinitely. In truth, the Sixth Army was already finished. It was merely waiting for formal recognition of its death. The siege had entered its final merciless chapter. In Führer headquarters, Hitler wrestled not with military logic but with his own pride and ideology. He could not fathom that an entire German field army, the largest ever encircled in history, would surrender under his watch. To him, defeat was dishonor, and dishonor demanded death, preferably in the form of last-stand heroics or suicide rather than capitulation. When news reached him that Paulus was considering surrender, Hitler seethed with rage and contempt. In an act both symbolic and cruel, he promoted Paulus to the rank of Field Marshal on January 30th, 1943, the 10th anniversary of his rise to power in Germany. The gesture carried a sinister message, for no German field marshal had ever surrendered in battle. By promoting him, Hitler expected Paulus to choose suicide over the humiliation of capture. It was less a reward than a death sentence wrapped in ceremonial honor. In Hitler's warped logic, this would preserve the myth of German invincibility, even in defeat. Yet Paulus was a man of pragmatism, not martyrdom, and his decision would defy his Führer's command. Paulus received the news of his promotion in the shattered ruins of a Stalingrad basement that served as his command post, surrounded by exhausted staff officers and the distant rumble of Soviet guns. He read the message with disbelief and quiet bitterness. He understood immediately what Hitler intended, that he was being asked to sacrifice himself to avoid the shame of capture. But Paulus was no fanatic. He had never sworn to die for Hitler but to serve Germany, and Germany in his eyes would gain nothing from his death. The Sixth Army was already beyond salvation, its soldiers too broken to fight, its situation utterly hopeless. To kill himself would be to abandon them in their darkest hour, and Paulus could not bring himself to do it. He confided to his aides that suicide was not an option, declaring that he had no intention of making himself a second Cato. His refusal marked a rare act of defiance against Hitler's will, though couched in the quiet dignity of a professional soldier. Instead of a hero's death, Paulus prepared to oversee the inevitable surrender. It was a decision that would echo through history, as symbolic as it was pragmatic. Meanwhile, the Red Army closed in with relentless precision, tightening the noose around the last German strongholds in Stalingrad. Soviet commanders, including Rokossovsky and Chuikov, coordinated methodical assaults that carved the pocket into smaller fragments. By late January, the Sixth Army had been split into two isolated groups, one in the northern industrial district, the other around the southern city center where Paulus remained. Communications between the two collapsed, and units were left fighting in isolation, with no orders but to survive as long as possible. Soviet loudspeakers broadcast offers of honorable surrender, urging the Germans to lay down their arms and spare themselves annihilation. Many frontline soldiers accepted, staggering out of their dugouts with hands raised too weak to resist further. Others fought stubbornly until Soviet tanks rolled over their positions, obliterating the last traces of resistance. The city that had once symbolized Hitler's ambition was now a frozen graveyard, where the Wehrmacht bled itself to death in the ruins. Paulus, realizing the futility of continued resistance, began preparing for formal surrender. Yet he delayed the final moment, torn between obedience to Hitler and duty to his men. On January 31st, 1943, the inevitable came. Soviet forces stormed Paulus's command bunker in the ruins of the Wehrmacht department store in central Stalingrad. The German field marshal, pale and gaunt, sat at a makeshift desk as Soviet officers entered, their weapons ready but unnecessary. Paulus offered no resistance, merely rising to his feet as his staff officers laid down their sidearms. The Soviets treated him with respect, recognizing the significance of capturing the first German field marshal alive. For Paulus it was not triumph but humiliation, tempered only by the knowledge that he had spared his men further pointless slaughter. He explained to his captors that he could not obey Hitler's suicidal orders, for he was responsible for the lives of his soldiers. His quiet dignity contrasted sharply with Hitler's fury in distant headquarters. News of his capture spread rapidly, shocking the world and devastating German morale. The legend of Wehrmacht invincibility had been shattered in a single moment. As Paulus surrendered in the south, the northern pocket continued to resist for 2 more days under General Karl Strecker. His men fought amidst the frozen ruins of the tractor factory and the Red October complex, where hunger and despair mingled with desperate courage. They had no illusions of relief, only a determination to fight until physically incapable of further resistance. Soviet artillery pounded their last strongholds, reducing entire buildings to rubble, while tanks roamed the ruins like predators searching for prey. By February 2nd, Strecker too had no choice but to capitulate, his exhausted survivors stumbling into captivity. The Battle of Stalingrad was finally over, after nearly 6 months of unrelenting carnage. What remained of the Sixth Army, once numbering over 300,000 men, was now an army of corpses and prisoners. Of the 91,000 taken into captivity, only a fraction would ever return to Germany after years in Soviet labor camps. The surrender marked not only the fall of a city, but the destruction of an entire field army. For Germany, it was the most devastating defeat yet suffered in the war. Hitler's reaction to Paulus's surrender was one of unrestrained fury and bitter disappointment. He denounced his field marshal as a coward, accusing him of betraying the honor of the German soldier. In private, he raged that Paulus should have shot himself rather than be paraded as a trophy by the Soviets. Propaganda ministers scrambled to spin the catastrophe, portraying the Sixth Army's sacrifice as heroic martyrdom for the Reich. But no amount of rhetoric could disguise the reality. An entire German army had been annihilated, and its commander had chosen captivity over death. The German people, hearing the grim news, were shaken to the core. For the first time, many began to question the infallibility of their Führer. Stalingrad was no longer just a battle, it was a national trauma, a wound that would never fully heal. The myth of unstoppable German conquest had crumbled in the frozen ruins of the Volga. Stalingrad had broken not only an army, but the illusion of invincibility. For the Soviets, the surrender of Paulus was a triumph beyond measure, both militarily and symbolically. Stalin reveled in the victory, announcing to the world that Hitler's best and largest army group had been destroyed. The Red Army had demonstrated its ability to plan and execute vast operations, reversing the tide of the war in dramatic fashion. Soviet propaganda made full use of the moment, parading prisoners through Moscow and celebrating Stalingrad as the turning point of the Great Patriotic War. The Allies too recognized its significance, hailing the Soviet victory as proof that Germany could be beaten decisively. In Berlin, however, the defeat cast a long shadow over strategy, morale, and Hitler's grip on reality. Stalingrad marked the beginning of Germany's long retreat, a retreat that would end only in the rubble of Berlin itself. Paulus, meanwhile, spent years in Soviet captivity, eventually becoming a reluctant figure in post-war propaganda campaigns. His refusal to die for Hitler had preserved his life but forever bound him to the story of Stalingrad. The surrender was not just the end of a battle, it was the dawn of a new phase of the war. When the guns finally fell silent in Stalingrad, in February 1943, the scale of devastation stunned the world. Operation Uranus, which had begun as a bold Soviet counteroffensive in November 1942, had culminated in one of the greatest disasters in military history for Germany. The once proud Sixth Army had been annihilated, its ranks reduced from over 300,000 soldiers to scattered remnants of prisoners, corpses, and broken survivors. The streets of Stalingrad were littered with frozen bodies, shattered equipment, and entire divisions erased from existence. For the Germans, the losses were irreplaceable, not just in manpower but in prestige, as their aura of invincibility crumbled with the encirclement and surrender. The Soviets, too, paid a dreadful price, with hundreds of thousands of soldiers killed or wounded in the months-long struggle. Civilians in the city had endured unimaginable suffering, trapped in a hellscape of hunger, bombardment, and slaughter. Yet, amidst the ruins, the Soviet Union emerged victorious, its people vindicated for their endurance and sacrifice. The world now recognized Stalingrad as the turning point of the Eastern Front. It was a battle that had not only destroyed an army, but shaken the foundations of Hitler's war machine. The toll in human lives defied comprehension. German losses in the Stalingrad campaign exceeded 300,000, including killed, wounded, and captured, while their Axis allies from Romania, Italy, and Hungary suffered catastrophic casualties of their own. The Soviets counted their dead in the hundreds of thousands, with estimates of total casualties, killed, wounded, and missing, rising to over 1 million. This staggering bloodletting made Stalingrad one of the bloodiest battles in human history, rivaled only by other colossal engagements on the Eastern Front. Entire towns and villages across southern Russia were depopulated, their young men consumed by the front lines. Families grieved for loved ones who would never return, while trains carried endless convoys of maimed veterans back to hospitals deep in the Soviet Union. Prisoners of war, over 90,000 from the German Sixth Army, stumbled into captivity, skeletal, frostbitten, and broken in spirit. Their march eastward became an infamous procession of misery, with thousands collapsing in the snow before ever reaching the camps. Of those taken prisoner, fewer than 6,000 would survive to return to Germany after the war. The battle had not only drained armies, but consumed generations. For the German soldiers who survived, the ordeal was a nightmare etched permanently into memory. Starved, diseased, and stripped of hope, they became prisoners in a hostile land, subject to brutal marches, inadequate shelter, and insufficient rations. Many died of typhus, dysentery, or simple exhaustion before reaching the vast Gulag network. Those who survived captivity faced years of forced labor, rebuilding Soviet infrastructure as part of Stalin's revenge against the invaders. Letters home were censored, and families in Germany were left with little knowledge of their loved ones' fates. For the Soviets, the prisoners were both a trophy and a resource, symbols of their triumph and a workforce to rebuild their shattered cities. Yet the treatment of these men underscored the brutal reciprocity of the war. Germany had shown no mercy in Russia, and Russia offered little in return. The suffering of the Sixth Army in captivity became part of the larger tragedy of Stalingrad, a grim epilogue to the destruction within the city. These prisoners carried with them the final proof of Hitler's hubris. For Germany, their loss marked both a human and symbolic catastrophe. On the German home front, the surrender at Stalingrad reverberated like a thunderclap. News of Paulus's capture shattered public morale, as ordinary Germans confronted the reality that the war was no longer a string of triumphs. Propaganda ministers had painted the campaign as a struggle of destiny, and now the catastrophe could not be hidden. Goebbels attempted to rally the nation with fiery speeches of total war, urging civilians to sacrifice everything for the survival of the Reich. But beneath the rhetoric lay despair, as countless families received telegrams confirming the loss of sons, husbands, and fathers. In towns and villages across Germany, black mourning ribbons appeared in windows, symbols of grief repeated thousands of times. The myth of Wehrmacht invincibility had been destroyed, and with it, confidence in Hitler's leadership began to crack. Still, the regime clamped down harder, censoring dissent and tightening control over information. Stalingrad was recast in propaganda as a heroic last stand, even as the truth spread quietly among the people. The defeat was not just military, but psychological, eating into the heart of Nazi Germany. Internationally, the shock of Stalingrad echoed across the globe. In London and Washington, the news was received with jubilation, for it meant that Hitler's advance into the Soviet Union had finally been halted and reversed. Newspapers heralded the Soviet victory as proof that the Red Army could not only resist but also defeat the Wehrmacht in battle. Allies who had doubted Stalin's pleas for a second front now viewed the Soviet Union with renewed respect. Neutral nations, watching the tides of war, began to reconsider their calculations, sensing that Germany might not be invincible after all. In Tokyo, Japanese leaders observed the defeat with unease, recognizing that their Axis partner was weakening under the weight of war. In occupied Europe, resistance movements found hope, encouraged by the proof that the Nazi war machine could be broken. The global perception of the war shifted in those months, with Stalingrad standing as a symbol of turning tides. The balance of power was beginning to tilt, slowly but unmistakably, away from the Axis. Operation Uranus had reshaped the course of history. For the Soviet Union, the aftermath of Stalingrad was both a triumph and a test. The victory was celebrated as a national redemption, proof that their sacrifices had not been in vain. Stalin was elevated to near-mythic status, his leadership credited with turning the tide of war against the Germans. Soviet propaganda broadcast images of the captured Germans, paraded through Moscow as living proof of victory. Yet behind the celebrations lay exhaustion, for the Red Army had paid an enormous price in blood. Factories worked tirelessly to replace lost tanks and guns, while hospitals overflowed with wounded veterans. Cities in the Volga region lay in ruins, with civilians struggling to survive amidst the devastation. The Soviet people understood that victory at Stalingrad was only one step in a long and brutal war. Still, it instilled a newfound confidence, a belief that the Germans could be beaten, no matter how powerful they seemed. The victory became a rallying cry that would carry the Soviets westward in the years to come. The destruction of the Sixth Army also had far-reaching military consequences. Germany had lost not only men, but also vast quantities of tanks, artillery, vehicles, and supplies that could never be replaced in sufficient numbers. The Wehrmacht, once capable of rapid offensives across thousands of kilometers, now faced chronic shortages that hampered every operation. The Eastern Front, already stretched thin, became vulnerable as more and more divisions were consumed in defensive struggles. Hitler's strategic credibility was badly damaged, for his refusal to allow Paulus to break out had doomed the army. Within the German high command, quiet dissent grew, though few dared challenge the Führer openly. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, seized the momentum, launching follow-up offensives that pushed deeper into Axis-held territory. The Wehrmacht would never again regain the initiative on the Eastern Front, forced instead into a long, grinding retreat. Stalingrad had tipped the balance irreversibly. From this point forward, Germany was on the defensive. Above all, the aftermath of Operation Uranus left a scar on human memory, a symbol of both the cruelty and resilience of war. The shattered city of Stalingrad stood as a testament to suffering, its ruins a silent witness to the scale of destruction unleashed in modern conflict. For survivors both Soviet and German, the battle became a lifelong shadow, shaping their stories and their nations' histories. In the decades that followed, Stalingrad was remembered not merely as a military turning point, but as a lesson in the cost of hubris, endurance, and sacrifice. It symbolized the moment when Hitler's dreams of domination began to unravel, and when the Soviet people found the strength to rise from near destruction to ultimate victory. The millions who suffered in its aftermath became part of a shared legacy of pain and defiance. For the world, the battle underscored the brutal truth that victory on such a scale came only through unimaginable loss. Operation Uranus had reshaped not only the map of the war, but the conscience of humanity. Stalingrad's shadow would stretch across generations. The victory at Stalingrad was more than just a Soviet triumph. It was the moment the Second World War shifted irrevocably against Nazi Germany. Until late 1942, Hitler's armies had seemed unstoppable, sweeping across Europe, the Balkans, and deep into the Soviet Union. Their aura of invincibility had shattered Allied morale, and even neutral states doubted the possibility of German defeat. But Operation Uranus destroyed not only the German Sixth Army, but the myth of German invulnerability. The Wehrmacht, once the master of blitzkrieg, was exposed as vulnerable to encirclement, deception, and attrition. The psychological blow was immense. For the first time, the German public understood that victory was no longer assured. For the Soviets, it was a vindication of years of suffering and sacrifice, proving that their resilience could turn the tide. The world now recognized that Hitler had overreached, and that his gamble at Stalingrad had backfired catastrophically. The turning point was not abstract but tangible, measured in ruined armies, shattered morale, and a decisive shift in the balance of power. Stalingrad had become the graveyard of Hitler's dreams. The Eastern Front, once a stage for German offensives, now began its transformation into a battleground of German defense and retreat. Operation Uranus revealed the fragility of the Axis coalition, with Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian armies collapsing under the weight of Soviet assaults. These allies, poorly armed and inadequately supported, could not hold against the Red Army's concentrated might. Their destruction left Germany overextended, exposing flanks and draining resources that were already stretched thin by campaigns in North Africa and Western Europe. In Berlin, Hitler fumed and blamed his partners, but the strategic consequences were unavoidable. Germany could no longer rely on its allies to secure vast front lines, forcing its own divisions into defensive roles that sapped their strength. For the Soviets, this weakness became a lever, enabling further offensives that widened the battlefield beyond Stalingrad. What began as a single counteroffensive expanded into a relentless push that gradually rolled back German positions across southern Russia. The tide of war had turned, not in a single moment, but through a chain reaction set in motion by Stalingrad. From this point on, Germany's empire of conquest began to crumble. The symbolism of Stalingrad resonated far beyond the battlefield itself. For the Soviet people, the city became a sacred symbol of sacrifice and endurance, the place where ordinary soldiers and civilians alike stood against the full fury of Hitler's war machine and prevailed. Streets once soaked in blood were now celebrated as monuments of heroism, immortalized in songs, speeches, and propaganda posters. Stalin used the victory to cement his legitimacy, presenting himself as the architect of triumph and the guardian of the Soviet people. For the Allies, Stalingrad was proof that the Soviet Union could not only hold but crush German armies, strengthening the bonds of the Grand Alliance. In occupied Europe, resistance fighters looked to Stalingrad as a beacon of hope, proof that tyranny could be defeated with courage and resolve. Even in the United States and Britain, where the Eastern Front had often seemed distant, Stalingrad captured the public imagination as the battle that had saved civilization. The city's name itself became synonymous with defiance and victory. The symbolic power of Stalingrad carried weight far beyond its ruins. It was the moral pivot of the war. Hitler's prestige, both domestically and internationally, suffered a devastating blow in the wake of Operation Uranus. His decision to hold the Sixth Army at all costs, rather than allowing Paulus to attempt a breakout, became a symbol of reckless hubris. Within the Wehrmacht, trust in Hitler's military judgment began to erode, even among loyal generals who had once revered his intuition. Stalingrad exposed the dangers of micromanagement, where political obsession overrode strategic logic. Yet Hitler refused to accept responsibility, instead scapegoating his commanders, allies, and even the weather for the defeat. The disaster created fractures within the Nazi hierarchy, as whispers of dissent began to circulate in corridors that had once echoed only with obedience. For ordinary Germans, the loss shattered illusions that the Führer's destiny was guided by fate or genius. The idea of inevitable victory, so carefully cultivated by years of propaganda, was broken beyond repair. Stalingrad marked the beginning of a slow, inexorable erosion of Hitler's authority. It was the first crack in a facade that would eventually collapse. For the Red Army, Stalingrad was the foundation of a new kind of war. No longer merely defending their homeland, Soviet forces now prepared for sustained offensives that would drive westward into occupied territories. Operation Uranus had shown that careful planning, deception, and massed firepower could not only blunt German attacks, but annihilate entire enemy formations. The victory gave Soviet commanders the confidence to launch Operation Little Saturn, and later the great offensives that would liberate Eastern Europe. It also signaled a shift in momentum. The Red Army was no longer reactive but proactive, shaping the battlefield and dictating the tempo of war. Factories across the Soviet Union redoubled production, supplying the vast machine of war with tanks, guns, and aircraft in ever-increasing numbers. Soldiers who had once fought with desperation now carried a sense of inevitability. From Kursk to Berlin, the path of Soviet advance began at the banks of the Volga. Stalingrad was not the end of the struggle, but the beginning of a relentless offensive. The Soviet Union had crossed a threshold from survival to victory. On the global stage, Stalingrad reshaped diplomatic dynamics within the Allied coalition. Roosevelt and Churchill, who had long faced pressure from Stalin to open a second front, now saw the Soviet war effort in a new light. The sheer scale of the Soviet victory proved that the Red Army was the decisive force against Germany, deserving of full support. Western leaders praised the heroism of Stalingrad in speeches, while their people marveled at the determination of the Soviet people. At the same time, the victory deepened Stalin's bargaining power in future conferences, allowing him to demand greater concessions on strategy and post-war arrangements. Stalingrad demonstrated that the Soviet Union would not only survive, but emerge as a dominant power in the post-war world. Allies celebrated the victory, but they also understood its implications. The Soviet Union was now a superpower in the making. Stalingrad had altered the balance not just of the battlefield but of geopolitics. The war's future and the world's would be shaped by its consequences. The defeat at Stalingrad also set in motion a series of cascading failures for the Axis. With the loss of an entire field army, Germany's ability to mount large-scale offensives was permanently crippled. The Wehrmacht would fight fiercely in the years to come, but never again would it achieve the sweeping advances of 1941 and 1942. Instead, it was forced into desperate defensive actions, trying to hold a shrinking front against an enemy that grew stronger each month. In Italy, in North Africa, and on the Western Front, Germany would now face increasing pressure as its resources dwindled. The confidence of its allies waned, with Hungary and Romania quietly reconsidering their loyalty to the Axis cause. Stalingrad had shown them that Germany could not guarantee victory, undermining the foundations of the coalition. From this point forward, Germany's enemies sensed blood in the water. The war was far from over, but the momentum had shifted irrevocably. The decline of Nazi Germany had begun, and Stalingrad was its point of origin. Looking back, historians and soldiers alike have come to see Stalingrad as the defining hinge of the Second World War. It was the moment when Hitler's grand vision of conquering the East collapsed under the weight of its own overreach. The battle's outcome demonstrated the limits of German military power and the resilience of a Soviet Union that many had written off as doomed in 1941. For the millions who lived through it, Stalingrad was not merely a battle, but a crucible of suffering, endurance, and ultimate redemption. Its lessons echoed across generations: the dangers of hubris, the cost of total war, and the extraordinary capacity of nations to resist annihilation. Stalingrad became a symbol of the turning tide, a monument to both tragedy and triumph. Operation Uranus had transformed the Eastern Front into a graveyard of German ambition. The Soviet Union, bloodied but unbroken, stood ascendant on the world stage. The world would never forget the turning point forged in the ashes of Stalingrad. From that moment on, victory over Nazi Germany was no longer a dream, it was inevitable.